Quick question. If you had to choose, would you rather survive 1 year in L.A.G or 1 year in a brutal winter apocalypse? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Anyway, on to the video. Jeong made his bold declaration as he started his intense stare-down with Bug. However, after seconds of quiet inaction, Dwayne finally had enough and asked what was wrong. Didn't he say he was him? Then why was he just standing there? Jeong replied that everything was good. It might not look like it, but his mind was currently big-braining this shit, so Dwayne shouldn't worry. But that aside, why was he so focused on his business? Shouldn't he be using this chance to recover instead? If he had the energy to cling so far up his ass, then surely he could spare some to recover, right? Choosing to ignore the meddling Dwayne, Jeong turned his focus back to Bug and himself. He might have sounded mad cocky, but in truth, he was also at his limit. After the severe thrashing Bug had blessed them with, his body was already on the brink of collapse, and any mishaps could spell their doom. If his final gamble didn't work out, then he might as well redeem that cheek-clapping coupon because they would be cooked. Luckily, things hadn't deteriorated to that point, so he still had some hope, although barely. Bug might have not realized this, but there were subtle differences in his bodily reactions when he attacked, and it was precisely these differences that he planned to exploit. Sure, it was a far-fetched plan, one more desperate than logical. But what else could he do? When facing off against a superior foe, even desperate gambles become valid tactics, provided you don't back down and give it your all. As for how things would turn out, why would he care about that when his only outcomes would be victory or death? In both cases, the crisis would be resolved, so why should he care? Bug noticed the slowly advancing Jeong and chuckled softly. Did the Chad really plan to face him on his own even after he'd proved he could clap them both as a tag team? Surely he couldn't be that crazy, right? Or maybe he'd discovered some sort of method to better level the playing field. In any case, it didn't matter to him because the duo would still be cooked. In fact, he preferred if they struggled like that, because it would make vanquishing them all the more enjoyable. Jeong guessed Bug's thoughts and clapped back immediately. He told the bastard to not get so cocky. As far as he was concerned, the so-called overwhelming power he now possessed was just a product of luck and plot armor. Without it, he would have been clapped ages ago. Bug smirked at Jeong's pitiful attempt at provocation. He told the Chad to stop spewing bullshit. If he could really defeat him as he'd claimed, then he should go ahead and do it, instead of bullshitting all the way over there. Oh, and just so he knew, his taunt had indeed worked because his desire to kill him had definitely skyrocketed. He very much wanted to hear the squeal he'd produce after getting his hand yanked off. Jeong told him bet. If he thought he had the ability to get him to squeal like a bitch, then he should go ahead and try it. Bug immediately accepted the challenge. He resolutely stepped forward. He couldn't keep Jeong waiting, after all. Jeong also stepped forward, but he didn't immediately act. Instead, he cast his gaze to the squirming faces on Bug's body. After careful observation, he'd realized that those parts were the most chaotic on Bug's body. His guess was that the lingering spirits in those faces still held an intense greed for souls, making the body's control and reactions sloppy. If he could exploit that weakness, then he might have a chance of bringing this bastard down. If he couldn't, well, there was no point thinking about that, because he still had to try anyway. Bug didn't hesitate any longer and immediately lunged at Jeong. He moved with so much speed that he'd basically spawned before the latter. Jeong acted quickly and instantly erected his electric shield. Thanks to his action, he'd barely managed to block the sneak attack, although that was definitely too close for his comfort. Locking back in, Jeong noticed that Bug's speed had increased once again. He didn't know if it was a result of the fool being enraged, but that level of intensity was definitely not something he could handle right now. If he wanted to buy as much time as he could to enact his plan, then he had to switch tactics. Just as he was about to act, Bug suddenly doubled his assault, pinning him down once again. He taunted Jeong, asking the Chad where his past bravado was. Didn't he say he would clap him? Then where was that smoke? Or was he planning to hide behind his shield forever? Well, if that was the case, he might as well help him out. There was nothing like a little beating to stimulate that inner fire after all. Saying so, he easily tore through Jeong's shield, landing a nasty punch on his face. The blow sent Jeong flying, causing him to crash pathetically against the wall. When Jeong finally collected himself, he couldn't help but curse his shitty luck. Not only was the bastard leagues above him in terms of speed and strength, But his electric shield was also useless against him, meaning he couldn't even block his attacks. If he added all those points together, then it was clear this was a fight he had no business winning. However, was he to give up just because of that? Hell nah. He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. Like hell he'd give up that easily. He'd rather die than let this many-faced bastard stomp on him. Bug noticed the determined gleam in his eyes and shot him a confused glance. Didn't he have a big-brained plan he wanted to execute? Then what was he waiting for? If he didn't hurry up and use all his trump cards, then he'd miss the opportunity to do so, because he was done playing around. Jeong registered the threat but didn't react. He continued to mad dog Bug, showing no signs of action. Bug clicked in annoyance before lunging at Jeong. Fine. If the fool didn't want to show his hand, then he'd force him to. He refused to believe Jeong would still hold back when his very life was in danger. He rushed at him, his claws poised to stab Jeong through. Just as his attack was about to land, Bug's body suddenly stiffened, causing him to stop immediately. He puzzlingly shot his gaze to the left, wondering what the hell was going on. To his shock, he found that the face on his arm was attempting to break free, resulting in his body stiffening. Not only that, the creepy fucker had its tongue out, almost as if it was hungry for something. Bug stared in horror at the sight, puzzled by what was going on. When he looked in the direction the face was pulling him toward, everything suddenly made sense. Turns out the lingering spirit in the face was greedy for some souls, so it revolted and attempted to seize control of the body to go after it. Not only that, there were other souls scattered around the body, meaning Bug's horror was just beginning. Predictably, the various faces on his body collectively revolted, each going after a lump of souls. Not to mention, the souls were perfectly spaced out, making movement impossible under their collective pull. Bug realized his dire predicament and cursed furiously. Was this the so-called divine punishment for excessive greed? If he'd known things would turn out like this, he wouldn't have consumed so many corpses. Jeong smirked at the trapped Bug as he slowly rose from the ground. He then burst out laughing, taunting that it wasn't his time to die just yet. However, since one of them definitely has to die, why don't Bug be a darling and do just that? Bug shouted in rage, asking Jeong what he'd done. He might not be the smartest, but he was damn sure none of this was a coincidence. Jeong replied that of course it wasn't. How foolish was he to even think it was? There was no way the mighty him would rely on such things to survive. As for how he did it? Well, he can only be a Chad and explain to his small brain how the big boys plan shit out. It wasn't that complicated, really. He simply gave him and his body what they wanted. Souls. Of course, his body is a mess of faces, spirits, and greed, so the likelihood of the current situation happening was rather high. He'd suspected the spirits in the faces wouldn't be able to resist the temptation of souls, so he'd gambled on this plan. Luckily, things had turned out great, and he could fully enjoy him standing there, looking stupid. Bug's face instantly fell. He realized he'd been playing on Jeong's palm the entire time. During their fight, when he'd thought he was giving Jeong a thorough cheek polishing, it turned out the Chad was using those attacks to stealthily spread souls around him. Not only that, the cunning bastard had done so in a way that the souls would be out of reach, preventing him from absorbing any of them. And since he couldn't absorb them, he would continue to be trapped by the pulling faces, rendering any resistance futile. Speaking of faces, their greed for souls suddenly intensified, causing them to pull even harder. They relentlessly tugged at Bug's body, causing the already frail balance to collapse. Little by little, the various faces tore free from the body, pulling Bug's limbs with them. Bug screamed in agony, but by then it was already too late, and his body quickly became a mangled mess. The severely mangled Bug collapsed to the ground, a pool of putrid blood pooling beneath him. He wheezed in pain, helpless as his mutilated limbs crawled toward the scattered souls, and by extension, their deaths. Dwayne saw this, and his expression couldn't help but darken. He'd already known L.A.G was a dark place, but never had he imagined he'd witness something like this. He tried to turn his eyes away, but deep down he knew it wouldn't help, because this was L.A.G and this was his new reality. Jeong, however, completely ignored the brutality, choosing to focus solely on Bug. So what if the current situation was tragic? Could it match up to the horrors he'd experienced in his regressions? Nah, fuck that. He'd rather focus on this Bug bastard because he still had a bone or two to pick with him. What was it he'd said to him a while back? Right. He wanted to hear the sound he'd make while dying. Well, The same was true for him. He too wanted to hear the sound Bug would make while dying. Bug caught the smug smirk on Jeong's lips and roared in rage. He'd known he was a vindictive person, but to think this Jeong bastard was equally as vindictive, if not petty. He roared in anguish, making sure to vent all his pent-up emotions. Jeong looked at the screaming Bug and responded calmly. Nice, that's how it should be. After all the trouble he'd caused him, he should at least struggle like that before he meets his end. Oh, and in case he thinks Lag would save him again with another ass-pull power-up, or his many lives would kick in, he should forget about that. Lag isn't so generous as to save a scam like him twice. As for the multiple lives, they were all linked to the faces on his body, and since those faces have already left him, he now has just the one life, his own. In other words, he was cooked, and there was nothing he could do about it. Blood sputtered at the end of his speech, and a dying whimper followed, proving Jeong stood on business. The panel then zoomed in on our boy, showing just how he'd ended the fiend. Death by stabbing. Of course, since Jeong is still him, he had to make it more flashy, so he drove the blade through Bug's neck. All in all, the bastard was finally dead, and Jeong collected his soul just to make sure. Dwayne, who'd at some point regrouped with Jeong, sighed in relief as he stared at the mangled corpse. He quickly suppressed his instinct to spit on it and turned to Jeong instead. With a serious face, he told Jeong he was done with this room and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Jeong said bet. He too wanted to leave that shit as quickly as possible. The duo thus moved forward, arriving at the room's exit soon after. Not wasting any time, they decisively walked out, causing the door to B713 to shut with a bang. After their departure, the duo found themselves in another room, this one way emptier than the last. To the side was a merchant's room, the perfect place to restock and regroup. Jeong sighed in relief at the sight. At least they weren't forced into a fight upon their arrival. If things continued like that, then he might just be tempted to believe their shitty luck had finally changed for the better. Dwayne chuckled by the side, almost as if he'd sensed Jeong's naive thoughts. He then called out to him, informing him that the merchant's door wouldn't open. Jeong's lips twitched. He immediately closed in on the door, all whilst cursing Lag for being shitty. Damn it. Couldn't it at least allow a brief second of happiness? Damn. Luckily, things weren't as bad as Jeong had imagined, and the vendor's door wasn't truly locked. Turns out the door needed a special key to open it, and that key was the labyrinth key. Jeong cracked a slight smile at the notification. Labyrinth key? Well, he did have one of those, so the door should be like Alibaba and Open Sesame in this bitch. He immediately pulled out the key and used it to unlock the vendor's door. Dwayne caught a glimpse of the key and shot Jeong a curious glance. He'd imagined the key would be the biggest obstacle in the room, but who would have thought Jeong Papi had it on his person this entire time? Truly, he was him, and those nicknames weren't for show. Reining back his glazing, Dwayne asked Jeong where he'd procured the key. Jeong replied that it was a gift from the labyrinth boss. Well, technically, he did have to clap it all the way through Sunday. But yes, it could be considered a gift, especially with the miraculous effect the key had. Dwayne didn't pry further. Why should he, when he was benefiting for free? As for Jeong potentially clapping some unknown boss and getting a gift from it, why would he be surprised when the homie had been clapping mega cheeks ever since he'd known him? The only pity would be that the Chad's clapping only extended to monsters and never true maidens. If he had as much luck with the baddies as he did with the clapped bosses, then Jeong would truly be the honored one, and not the maidenless soul he currently was. Anyway, moving on from Dwayne's, or rather Not's, wild banter, the two Chads finally entered the room. Within it was a vendor, as you might have guessed, and also, surprisingly, medical pods. I'm not quite sure why those are in there, but hey, why question blessings when they fall in your lap? The duo certainly didn't, and eagerly nodded toward the vendor. The vendor Chad responded to the nod, informing them that he was down for business. Jeong smiled in relief and quickly made his way to the Chad. However, halfway through the walk, he realized something was off. After meeting several vendors in this life and his past regression, he noticed that this vendor was odd. At first, he didn't understand why he got that feeling, but a little bit of reflection immediately gave him an answer. The vendor Chad, in all his glory, was actually a short king. Jeong was taken aback by this, as it was the first time he'd seen a vendor so tiny. However, what did the vendor's height have to do with him? So long as the Chad could deliver on what he was supposed to and not shortchange him by overpromising and underperforming, he was good. He immediately told the short unit to show him his stuff, obviously eager to see what he was working with. The vendor said bet and proudly unveiled his package. Contrary to what you might have thought, the short king was indeed mighty. In fact, his package was so large that he had those 6 feet and over vendors beat. Without a doubt, this was a true testament to, it's not the size of the package that matters, but how you handle it. Pause. Moving on from the obviously sussy narration, we finally focus back on the story. Jeong, who was bewildered by Not's pervy thoughts, firmly ignored the sussy baka and turned his gaze to Dwayne. He advised the Chad to go all out and buy everything he needed. Since run-ins with vendors were pretty uncommon in L.A.G, he should use this chance and not waste it. Dwayne said okay and immediately stepped forward. He then bought everything he needed before leaving the spot to Jeong. After the two had completed the shopping spree, they made a quick detour to the medical pods, obviously using them to heal up to their peak condition. Done with that, the duo left the room, and it is also at this time that we see their new drip. For Jeong, the change wasn't as drastic, as he only added a bit of flavor to his already killer drip. For example, the Devil's Leather Jacket, formerly the Demon's Leather Jacket, had been enhanced a second time, making the total buffs double. His agility, as a result, had risen from 30% to 80%, provided he was nestled in the bosom of darkness. On his wrist was a new piece of equipment, specifically, the Shadow Demon's Bracelet. The equipment allowed the use of an active skill. In the Shadow, ranked M. As for its effect, it basically channeled the Shadow Monarch, allowing for free and unrestricted movement through shadows. Apart from those two, Jeong also purchased Hydra Pants, which helped with health recovery and regeneration. Last was a bunch of medical supplies, the typical potions and pills. On the personal power front, or rather, the cheeks-clapping front, he'd purchased a total of 4 passive skills. I won't introduce them in detail because we all know the homie Jeong will just pull skills out of his ass so long as it suits him in battle. However, to satisfy the Chads and Chadlets with OCD, I'll briefly mention their names and have them on screen as I deliver this sweet and spicy voiceover. Hopefully, by the time this chatty voice finishes tickling your ears, and you also finish. Pause. All the relevant information should have been shown. Moving on, we also learned that Jeong had used a special feature, or rather, item, from the vendor to permanently swap a skill while maintaining the original level. The skills in question were the Swordsmanship skill and the Weapon Mastery skill. The Swordsmanship level 10 was swapped with the Weapon Mastery level 10. All in all, the big splash cost our boy a whopping 400 souls, and he only had 71 souls left in his pocket. Moving on, Jeong shifted his gaze to the unit Dwayne. The Big Poppy had also bought some new drip, but the author purposely, or maybe unintentionally, ignored it, so we don't get detailed info about it. However, he does look fly, so make sure to send your love to the Chad Dwayne. With the shopping and recovery done, the two units decisively walked to the next room, eager to tackle the new horrors. Dwayne, in particular, was so excited that he couldn't stop the slight bounce in his steps. He confidently walked forward, his new drip and swagger on full display. Jeong also felt confident and immediately led the way into the next room. What greeted them was a room covered in purple mist. The air in the room was both sultry and steamy, hinting at some debauchery going on. To the left and right of the hall were red-scented candles, which further added to the ambiance. As for the occupants of the room, well, let's just say they were rather occupied, clapping some literal cheeks. I know I joke about this a lot, but this time it's indeed true. Backs are genuinely being broken in this room. This Chad, for example, seems to have passed out, having completed a rather intense sesh. I'm not sure why he's drooling like that, but I can only assume the blonde baddie is a snatcher, so our boy probably got his soul snatched. To the side was another couple, all hot and steamy from the smash. Judging by how the maiden is laid out, we can assume our boy did his thing, and that back was properly cracked. Pause. Up on the pedestal was a live show with a session of soul snatching happening in real time. I don't know what the Chad is feeling, but with his back arched in like that, I can assume his soul is with Hades right now. Dwayne saw this and couldn't help but gulp in surprise. To think Paradise had always been in L.A.G, and he had no idea this entire time. Jeong caught the foolish grin on his face and told him to lock in. Now wasn't the time to get lost in debauchery. Inwardly, however, he cursed his shitty luck, because this room was definitely going to be, hard. Speaking of hard, a new maiden joined the fray. She was the same demon who was currently snatching that I meant poor, Chad's soul on the pedestal. She cast a lust-filled glance at them, delighted that new prey had joined the party. Jeong spared her a glance before quickly turning his gaze away. Nothing good would come out of lingering on that view for long. He then addressed Dwayne, warning the latter to be careful. Something in that room was off, and it wasn't just the smashing going on. His instincts were telling him that the states of the players were abnormal, and it definitely had something to do with that succubus wench, Fibichi. Suppressing the lingering unease in his heart, Jeong reflected on his regressions thus far. He realized that this room, and probably the boss as well, were things he'd never encountered in his past regressions. He had no idea what was going on, but his ample experience told him the boss would be tricky to deal with. Sure, she looked weak on the outside, and her offensive power seemed to be lacking, but that was precisely why she would be tricky to handle. There were never weak bosses in L.A.G, and he was sure this wench had her quirks as well, although he very much dreaded experiencing them firsthand. Locking back in, he cast his gaze across the room. Ignoring the humping fools, he quickly realized there was no exit in sight. Dwayne grew tense at this, but Jeong told him not to worry. Handling the exit issue would be easy. All they had to do was smash, or rather beat, the boss, and the exit would naturally appear. As for how they'll do that, there was no need to rush. They could continue collecting visual data for now, for research purposes, of course. Fibichi heard Jeong's, or rather Not's, flimsy excuse and immediately cast her gaze over. She licked her lips, an unrestrained desire tugging on them. She then gulped at the new prey, obviously eager to give them a taste. Jeong noticed her strange expression and instantly went on high alert. He watched as she dismounted her worthy steed, and his heart ached a little for the poor fool. Seeing as he couldn't even close his mouth, it was safe to say the Chad was gone. Another pitiful fallen in the pursuit of cheeks. Offering the Chad a silent salute for his sacrifice, he focused his attention back on Fibichi. The succubus wench quickly donned her robe and stared intently at the boys. Before the duo could react, she instantly appeared before Jeong, her tongue already licking his chin. Jeong freaked out at this sight, and even the words he'd planned to say were caught in his mouth. He wondered how the wench had moved so fast, and how she'd done so without raising his alarm. However, that was something to be worried about later. For now, he should go ahead and deal with this fool, because his face wasn't for everyone to lick. He viciously swung his sword, delivering a nasty slash at Fibichi. Unfortunately, the baddie's speed was the real deal, so she easily dodged that shit. Jeong glanced at the escaped boss, and his face couldn't help but darken. He could have sworn she was just in front of him. So how had she gotten that far already? Not to mention, he'd felt a light weight on his attack, meaning he'd definitely hit something. So how did she escape so easily? Well, anyway, it didn't matter how she'd done it. All that mattered was his attack landed, and the bitch could at least be harmed. That aside, he also got a clear view of them boobies, so he'd say the exchange was rather fruitful. Speaking of exchange, Fibichi gave him a clearer view of the peaks before taunting him some more. She told him such wounds couldn't do shit to her, so he had to try way harder than that. Jeong returned her gaze but didn't fall for the taunt. Instead, he focused his attention on the mist on her lips, wondering what the hell it was. Soon, he realized the same mist was all over them, and his danger senses instantly flared. He immediately jumped back, warning Dwayne to do the same. The giant unit didn't hesitate and instantly followed suit. After they'd escaped, Jeong caught a slight sniff of the purple mist, and his face instantly heated. He cautiously stopped breathing and warned Dwayne to do the same. Although he still had no idea what the purple mist was, the subtle heat in his body, and his instincts as a man, were warning him to be careful. So he did just that. Fibichi noticed his quick reactions and stellar performance and frowned slightly. She instantly realized taking down the duo wouldn't be easy, especially with Jeong around. However, just because it was difficult didn't mean it was impossible. She had more than enough means to make it happen. That being said, she decisively deployed one of them, commanding her slaves to attack the duo. Jeong and Dwayne tensed up from the words, realizing it was bound to be a gruesome fight. They each picked a side of the room, with Dwayne handling the left and Jeong the right. As for Fibichi, she stayed back to watch the show, confident her depraved soldiers would handle the smoke. Jeong ignored her and locked in on the charging enemy. He'd initially thought this would be a tough battle, but judging by how the fool was charging at him recklessly, without even putting up his guard, he was compelled to reevaluate the situation. From the looks of it, the poor fool was out of his mind, and what was left was basic instincts, definitely insufficient to pose a threat to him. He thus locked in, zapping the shit out of the bastard. Maybe it was because he was drained from the smash, but the fool went down surprisingly quickly, eliciting a soft sigh from Jeong. This was good, as he didn't want to fight a long battle anyway. However, if there was a point to frown over, it would be that the bastard didn't drop a soul. Jeong was certain the fool was dead, so what was going on? Was there something he was missing? Or was L.A.G back to its shenanigans again? As he was still mulling things over, a loud roar bellowed from the side, drawing his attention. He turned just in time to catch Dwayne delivering a savage punch, completely caving a bastard's face in. However, contrary to the congratulatory thumbs up he wanted to give the Chad, his face suddenly turned somber as Phoebus had launched a sneak attack on Dwayne. The cunning wench had bided her time, choosing the best moment to attack. She instantly used her purple mist, blowing a whole fog of it up Dwayne's nose. Dwayne was caught unaware, and before he knew it, the mist was already in his system. Fuck. Jeong peeped this sight, and the unease in his heart drastically increased. He wanted to do something about it, but by then, it was already too late. Not to mention, Dwayne wasn't the only one in danger right now. Behind Jeong was a stalking foe who quickly used his moment of distraction to launch a sneak attack. She clung to our boy, making sure to smother him with the smoothness. Jeong savored the delicate peaks before yelling at the wench to get off. Inasmuch as he liked the heavenly feel, he knew now wasn't the time to get lost in that shit. He decisively grabbed the bitch's hand, doing his best to pry her off. However, to his surprise, despite his immense strength, he still couldn't pull the baddie off him. Maybe it was because of her innate ability, or that post-nut clarity had her on steroids. Either way, the maiden didn't budge, which greatly surprised Jeong. Just as he was about to resort to more desperate measures, a shout rang out from the side, yanking his attention. Jeong quickly turned to check, and his scalp instantly tingled. A new foe had joined the fray, and this one wasn't fucking around. He charged in, dick swinging, demanding for Jeong to give up the cheeks. Jeong said fuck that as he tore his gaze away from the D. He tried his best to get the wench off of him as he strived to dodge to the side. Unfortunately, the Chad read his intentions and instantly moved to intercept. He lunged in, dick first, ready to shove that thing down Jeong's face. Jeong said hell no and immediately dodged to the side. Luckily, he did so, as he narrowly avoided a dick bump to the face. As for the maiden on his back, he crashed that hoe into the wall, finally giving himself some wiggle room. With the well-sought reprieve, Jeong became more proactive, directly bringing the fight to the foe. He charged in, sword swinging, his rage and resentment evident. Never in his life had he ever been humiliated like this, and someone had to pay. And since he had a perfectly bricked up someone before him, that motherfucker would definitely be it. He drove his blade into his mouth, making sure he deep-throated that thing. When that wasn't enough, he twisted the blade a couple of times, showing his love and sincerity. Done with that, Jeong shifted his attention to the next prey on his list, the caked-up wench. He purposely left his back open, luring her to attack him. The baddie said, bet, and lunged at him immediately. She screamed at Jeong to play with her too since she was done watching the two have all the fun. Jeong's back itched at the comment, and he fiercely swung to decapitate this fool. What fun. What join in. Did she think the mighty him would have a choo-choo run on him? Nah, fuck that. He'd rather burn L.A.G to the ground than watch that happen. And if the gods themselves wanted that as well, then he'd burn them too. Done with his overdramatic and strangely overcompensating rhetoric, he studied the corpses some more. Just as he'd expected, the strange fools only gave him peeps of cheeks and boobs. There were no souls in sight. He wondered what was going on, but even that short second of silence was quickly interrupted. To his side was a looming foe, a sight that honestly startled Jeong. Dwayne, with all his glory, was currently held hostage by Phoebus, and his condition was truly peculiar. He had his head down, and wisps of purple mist slowly seeped from his nose. Not only that, a depraved look tinged his face, which greatly scared Jeong. Just as he was about to call out to him, the giant suddenly charged, forcing Jeong to lock in. He watched with bated breath as Dwayne lunged at him, a complicated feeling welling in his gut. Should he fight back, or should he take a beating? He had no idea what to do. However, even if he wanted to be passive, there was something he just couldn't ignore. Why the hell was Dwayne bricked up? What was going on in that head of his? If he thought this was that kind of Diddy party, then he'd be greatly disappointed. He shouted at Dwayne to wake up, all while fleeing in a frenzy. It wasn't that he was afraid of him, it's just that the situation left him no choice. Dwayne was his partner, so he couldn't attack him recklessly. Not to mention, Fibici was still in the room, so he had to guard against her as well. Damn, this was proving to be more troublesome than he'd thought. Jeong blocked Dwayne's punches, purposefully using the force to backpedal. He'd hoped the Chad would snap out of it soon, but that was proving more and more unlikely. Instead, the aphrodisiac seemed to be seeping deeper into Dwayne's system. The unit had a glossy look in his eyes, and his words were getting vulgar. He told Jeong to surrender the cheeks, promising to be gentle with him. Jeong said fuck that, and backpedaled even faster. He did his best to escape the crazed Dwayne, but the horny fool was just too fast. Finally, he caught up to Jeong, landing a nasty punch on our boy. The force sent Jeong flying, causing him to crash pathetically against the wall. Jeong swiftly recovered and raised his hands to block any subsequent attacks. As he did so, he spared a second to mull over his situation. Although Dwayne was indeed mighty, he'd become like the other sex slaves, choosing to ignore defense in favor of offense. Sure, he was still formidable, but it was a far cry from what the peak unit could do. Jeong smirked at this realization. If it was just that much, then he could handle it somewhat. Just as the thought crossed his mind, Dwayne suddenly stopped, and a gust of wind blew around him. His aura swiftly changed, and a depraved look tinged his eyes. He then shouted his love for Jeong, begging the latter to obediently give up the cheeks. Jeong screamed at him to shut up. Even if he was under the influence of an aphrodisiac, this was just too much. If he didn't get his shit together, then he might as well say fuck it and fight back. Dwayne, however, ignored that shit. Since Jeong was playing deaf to his confession, then he might as well scream it louder. He immediately drew in a deep breath, bellowing out a beast roar soon after. The roar hit Jeong hard, forcing him back against the wall. His already perilous situation instantly worsened, causing a slight panic to flash across his face. However, he was still him, so he held on with all he had. As he stared at the roaring Dwayne, Jeong realized something he'd overlooked this entire time. Dwayne was strong. It was only after he'd experienced it firsthand that he could truly appreciate just how much the unit had grown. Had it been any other time, he might have been delighted by this. However, the current situation didn't allow for that. Not only was his life in danger, but his chastity as well. Thus, he swiftly dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a stomp kick and a subsequent pounding by Dwayne. Jeong saw the crashed wall and his resolve steeled. He finally realized a passive approach wouldn't work. If he wanted to make it out alive, then he had to start returning punches. Thus, he savagely clocked Dwayne, sending the unit skidding into the distance. Dwayne felt the pain, but his horny ass easily ignored it. What was a mere pain when he hadn't shown Jeong his sweet loving? He decisively lunged back, his depravity intensifying by a nudge. Jeong's mood sank at this sight. Did the Chad really not tire? Or was the aphrodisiac mixed with that Colombian sauce? In any case, things weren't looking good, and he desperately needed a plan. Just as he was contemplating his next step, a sultry voice whispered from behind him, causing his back to stiffen. The voice was obviously from Fibici, who had at some point sneaked up on Jeong. She immediately blew her mist toward him, hoping to trap him as well. However, Jeong sensed the danger and instantly stopped breathing. He then covered his nose, making sure not to inhale any of the mist. As for Fibici, he headbutted the bitch, forcing her to retreat. Unfortunately, this left his front open, which Dwayne promptly took advantage of. He bashed our boy, sending him flying like a ragdoll. Jeong hit the wall with a thud, a sickening crack echoing around him. He weakly fell to his knees, an anguished breath escaping his lips. When he finally collected himself, a savage glint flashed across his eyes. He realized the time for jokes was over. If things continued to develop like that, then he might just die by Dwayne's hands before he even fought Fibici. Obviously, that was unacceptable to him, so he had to lock in. Dwayne, who was still controlled by his lust, continued his assault, completely unaware of the shadows surrounding Jeong. He lunged forward, seemingly oblivious to the obvious power-up Jeong was going through. He punched forward, sending a nasty hook toward Jeong. However, the punch met nothing but stone, as the unit was already gone. Well, technically, it wasn't stone, but rather Jeong's hand, as the Chad had literally caught the punch. Yes, I shit you not, our boy had caught Dwayne's punch. Talk about aura farming. Nestled in the bosom of darkness, Jeong unveiled his new transformation. He looked kinda like a budget Jin Woo, but that's neither here nor there. In any case, his aura in this new form was enough to make Dwayne pause, which in turn gave him an opening to counterattack. He warned Dwayne to snap out of it because he was done fucking around. He'd come too far to fall in a place like this, and in such a pathetic way. If the Chad didn't wake up now, he'd have no choice but to kill him. Fibichi heard Jeong's warning and chuckled slightly. Kill him? Did he truly have it in him to do so? Regardless, he was right about something. And that was it was time to end that shit. Sure, she would have loved to play with him further, but he was just too damn troublesome, so it was best if they ended it there. However, he shouldn't be sad because she had the best parting gift for him. Behind her was a veiled silhouette, probably the so-called gift. Jeong glared at her and said, "Cool." Since he'd decided to clap mega cheeks, it didn't matter to him whether it was 2 or 3. Phoebus should bring out all her slaves because he was about to run a train in this bitch. Jeong contemplated his options before settling on a path. Inasmuch as he wanted to embark on that train, he knew his immediate priority lay elsewhere. More specifically with Dwayne. Although he'd resolved to kill him if he continued to get in his way, he couldn't help but hold out some hope that the big unit could be saved somehow. I mean, he was Big Papi Dwayne, best bro Dwayne. And now that I think about it, with the horrendous death of female leads in this story, he was actually the best waifu by default. Best waifu Dwayne. Surely someone like that deserved one more chance at saving, right? Jeong surely thought so. He sincerely called out to the unit, begging him to snap out of it. When Dwayne didn't show any signs of waking up, Jeong decided to be more aggressive in his approach. He cocked his fist back, landing a devastating punch on Dwayne's horny gut. The unit was sent flying, only managing to stop his momentum after skidding off into the distance. When Jeong saw how far he'd punched the fool, he couldn't help but marvel at the sight. Sure, he'd known the shadow skill would grant him a buff to his abilities, but he hadn't thought the buff would be this absurd. Wasn't this plot armor a thud too much? His attack and defense were off the charts, and he could vaguely feel this wasn't the limit to his enhancement. If he really went all out, then Mega Cheeks would definitely be clapped in this room. Pause. The horny Dwayne, as if sensing Jeong's clapping thoughts, lunged in for a counterattack, his fist and D both hard. Jeong noticed the latter and said, "Fuck that," like hell he was sticking around for that smoke. He swiftly dove into the shadows, narrowly avoiding Dwayne's double smash. Double, get it? Ahem. Anyway, when the dust settled, Jeong slowly emerged from the shadows. Although he hadn't teleported far, he still grinned at the absurdity of the shadow skill. Not only was it great at buffs, it could also serve as a spectacular movement technique. If he used it carefully, then it could be extremely useful. As for how it worked, it borrowed from the essence of the Papi Jin Woo, allowing for instantaneous teleportation to other shadows, although the distance was very limited. Locking back in, Jeong charged in for seconds. Since he'd resolved to domestic violence the shit out of Dwayne, he was determined to see it through. Dwayne said, "Bring it," and prepared a punch of his own. If Jeong didn't want to willingly give up the buns, then he'd have no option but to take them. Thus, the two titans charged each other, each ready to clap, albeit in a different fashion. When they eventually clashed, Jeong said, "Psych," and dove into the shadows. He positioned himself for a nasty counter, landing a devastating punch on Dwayne's balls. The unexpected crack sent Dwayne reeling, and he couldn't help but scream in pain. He understood all was fair in love and war. But come on, wasn't this a bit too much? Jeong, however, didn't see anything wrong with his actions. Since the horny fool wanted to think with his D rather than his head, then it was only logical that he knock some sense into it. As for whether he doomed Dwayne's future descendants? Fuck that. What did that have to do with him? Just as he was about to give Dwayne the bros vs hoes speech, a sudden change occurred, catching Jeong completely off guard. A shadow suddenly appeared beside him, clocking the absolute shit out of him. Jeong was sent flying like a kite, and only regained his footing after skidding a considerable distance away. Unfortunately, by then the attacker was already upon him, and didn't hesitate to let another one fly. The unexpected speed left Jeong dazed, and he couldn't help but clench his jaw in frustration. He helplessly received another sucking. his reaction too slow to muster any resistance. When the attacker saw the stumbling Jeong, he decisively lunged in for another attack. He confidently swung his leg forward, not forgetting to flash our boy in the process. Jeong said, "Fuck that," and swiftly dove into the shadows. He didn't know what was up with the attackers today, but he really didn't want any part of that shit. If their attacks continued to have D's in them, then he might as well say, "Deuces," and leave this room. Luckily, things hadn't deteriorated to that point, so Jeong stayed put for now. He easily evaded the next attack, sinking deeper into the shadows. When Jeong finally rose from the shadows, he couldn't help but cast another glance at the nude attacker. Sure, he'd known he was formidable, but his absurd speed left him slightly surprised. If he hadn't dodged that attack just now, then his skull would have been crushed. Not to mention, the fool was so fast that he doubted he could have stopped it even if he wanted to. Shaking off the distracting thoughts, Jeong focused his attention on the attacker. The barrage had been so intense that he barely had any time to identify him. However, with things finally calming down, he guessed now was the best time to do so. He completely ignored the fool's rumblings about cheeks and focused on his silhouette. Through the mist and haze, Jeong saw a face he hadn't expected to see there. The homie Norman. Norman, noticing Jeong's confused gaze, cast him a cheeky smile. He gently greeted Jeong, saying that it was fate that they reunited like that. Jeong, however, tuned out his bullshit. He fixed his gaze on the mist surrounding Norman, noticing that it was way thicker than Dwayne's. Although he didn't know what that meant exactly, he was inclined to believe it signified the degree of control Phoebus had on her slaves. Just as he was mulling over what that implied exactly, Norman suddenly disappeared from his position, swiftly appearing behind Jeong. The big poppy didn't flinch and easily tracked him with his eyes. He scoffed at Norman's naivety, mocking him for believing he'd fall for the same trick twice. Well, since his blood was on his lower head, he couldn't really blame him though. However, just because he didn't blame him didn't mean he'd miss out on such an opportunity. He immediately clocked the bastard back, landing a devastating punch on his gut. Unfortunately, Jeong's joy was short-lived as Norman literally faded away. When Jeong saw this, he couldn't help but glance at the space before him in shock. What the hell was that? And since when did ghosts become a thing in L.A.G? However, upon careful consideration, he realized it wasn't a ghost, but teleportation. Norman had used the split second when his fist landed to teleport away. He didn't know how he'd managed that, but the fact that he did meant he was cooked. Jeong instantly locked in, raising his caution to the maximum. He realized the threat Norman posed to him, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. There was also Dwayne, but he too was just a sideline. His real cause of caution and fear was undoubtedly that wench Phoebus. Like he'd said before, there were never weak bosses in L.A.G. Just because she wasn't attacking didn't mean she was weak. On the contrary, her ability to buff up her slaves proved just how formidable she was. Unfortunately, he couldn't go for the queen until he took care of the pawns. Speaking of pawns, both Dwayne and Norman were gone. They'd simply disappeared, almost as if they'd never existed to begin with. Jeong's breath caught at this sight. He immediately raised his guard, wondering what the duo were plotting. Little did he know, Norman was already behind him, lunging in for a deadly attack. Jeong caught wind of the attack and swiftly dove back into the shadows. He then counterattacked, springing up with a nasty uppercut of his own. Unfortunately, Norman read the attack and instantly teleported away. He sprang up behind Jeong, going in for a sneak attack. Jeong felt the murderous intent and swiftly sunk into the shadows. He used the shadow teleportation, hoping to catch Norman lacking. However, the bastard was just too cautious. He instantly teleported away the second he felt a fist on his face. Jeong cursed in frustration, but ultimately, he was helpless against such a cowardly foe. He knew he was stronger, but what good was that strength if he couldn't land a hit? He glared viciously at the escaping Norman, thinking of ways to counter his teleportation. Just as Jeong was beginning to despair, Dwayne suddenly appeared behind Norman, holding the former in place. He shouted at Jeong to attack, promising to stop the slippery bastard from escaping. Jeong saw the returned Dwayne and immediately cued his MC theme song. His face blended into the shadows, seemingly telling Norman he'd fucked up. With one swift movement, he promptly sunk into the shadows. When he next appeared, he already had his blade through Norman's heart. Norman gasped at the absurd change of situation. He tried to save his heart, but such actions were obviously futile. With a resigned groan, he collapsed to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. Dwayne caught a glimpse of the dead Norman and immediately felt a chill run down his spine. He expressed his reluctance to end up like that, begging Jeong to at least cover his cheeks if he did. Jeong replied that he understood. On that note, he asked Dwayne to do the same for him. If he ever got ensnared by that wench, then Dwayne should kill him before she deflowered him. Matter of fact, if he died with his cheeks spread wide like the homie Norman over here, then he should burn the whole room down. No evidence was allowed to leak. Dwayne replied that he got him. The legacy of the Poppy Jeong would forever be untainted. Jeong said thank you before asking the lingering question. Was he okay? Dwayne replied that he was good. Apart from the obvious stiffness in his pants and the suspected cracked balls, he'd say he was spectacular. He thanked Jeong for that, by the way. Jeong continued like he hadn't heard Dwayne's sarcastic remark. He told the Chad there was no need for thanks. He was just doing his part, after all. But that aside, they should probably focus on this seductive wench. Dwayne said bet, and turned to face Phoebusy. The temptress picked up on their movement and immediately chuckled seductively. She told the Chads she was hella excited, evident by the waterworks in her hoo-ha. If the Chads could bring her as much fun as she thought they could, then this was bound to be a fun yet slippery ride. Jeong said, cool. Phoebusy should call him the Rain Man, because he was about to make it wet in this bitch. Phoebusy heard Jeong's declaration, and her body trembled in ecstasy. Make it wet? She definitely wanted to see what that felt like. However, why were they so stubborn? All she wanted was for them to stay with her and hump like crazy. Why was that a bad thing? Why were they resisting so much? Jeong kept his gaze on the baddie but ignored her question. He addressed Dwayne instead, drawing his attention to the fact that Norman, the currently caked-up corpse, didn't drop a soul as well. Dwayne mulled it over and shared his speculation on the matter. Phoebusy, this bitch, was literally sucking their souls after she, sucked their souls. He didn't know how accurate his deduction was, but it definitely wasn't the worst way to go. Phoebusy eavesdropped on their communication and chuckled at Dwayne's, or rather Not's, last words. If it wasn't that bad of a way to go, then why didn't they join her? Or could it be that she wasn't their type? Were they perhaps into something else? Something perverse? She calmly walked forward, making sure her curves swayed as she advanced. With a seductive voice, she asked the Chads what they liked. Did they perhaps swing this way? Preferring to have more meat in their taco? Or were they into the thick kinds, the kinds that were more than a handful, if you know what I mean? Maybe it was simpler than that, and they just wanted a little more experience in the sack? Those wrinkled and saggy titties do have their own charm, after all. Well, since they weren't reacting, it must mean it's something like this, right? They want that Lil Wayne, that lollipop, aka lolicon. Damn, what naughty dogs they are. Dwayne and Jeong stared at the rambling Phoebusy incredulously. What the hell was this bitch talking about? Lolicon? They didn't even like lollipops, so why would they like that? If anything, she did have a point with that thicker-than-gravy form from before. But of course they wouldn't admit that out loud. That aside, it seemed they had to silence her quickly because further talk would just lead to problems. Who knows? Maybe the FBI would raid their shit after hearing her baseless accusations. Jeong seriously nodded to the plan. He might be without bitches, but never would his name appear on that lollipop list. If he couldn't get them as thick as frozen peanut butter, as caked out as prime tsunade, then he might as well stay maidenless. Dwayne said facts and joined Jeong in the charge. Since they decided to stomp this bee, then they might as well get it done with the quickness. Phoebusy saw their approach, and her quiver of ecstasy intensified further. She told the Chads to come at her together. A threesome was always better after all. Jeong ignored her bullshit and rushed forward. He instructed Dwayne to fall back, only attacking after he'd successfully created an opening. Dwayne nodded in understanding and swiftly withdrew from the front line. He watched Jeong charge forward, patiently biding his time like a stealthy hunter, a booty hunter. As for Jeong, he immediately prepared a heavy punch, sinking into the shadows soon after. When he next appeared, he was already by Phoebusy's flank, chaining his punch with the previous movements. Like Mike Tyson, he let that hook fly, aiming straight for Phoebusy's delicate face. The baddie didn't even flinch and simply limboed the shit out of the punch. She even gave Jeong a double bounce, making sure the twins danced to the rhythm. As if that wasn't enough, she proceeded to lick Jeong's hand. She encouraged him to try harder. Only then would he stand a chance at bringing her down. Oh, and he should probably get his eyes off her pokeburst. This was a fight after all. Jeong heard her taunting tone and immediately backpedaled. He realized this fight would be tough, especially since he didn't have any fast, big damage attacks. However, that was not going to discourage him. If he didn't have them, then why couldn't he make them? He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok after all. Brimming with newfound confidence, Jeong conjured another ability out of his ass. He then swung at Fibichi, landing a nasty hit on her gut. The maiden tanked that shit, although her inner organs were damaged. She ignored the pain and giggled sheepishly at Jeong. This wasn't what she meant when she said she wanted her guts rearranged. Surely he understood that, right? Jeong glared at the maiden, but didn't respond to her tease. He instead focused on his attack and its damage. Contrary to what we believed, it wasn't actually an ass pull. It was a brilliant combination of shadow and lightning skills. Of course, the damage wasn't high, but that's not why he used it. His main goal was to create an opening for the Chad Dwayne. As if on cue, Dwayne spawned behind Fibici, firmly grabbing her arms. He told her to stay still because there was no way he'd release her crazy ass. Fibici maintained her teasing smile and told Dwayne she would comply. Why wouldn't she, when she had a big strong man taking her from behind? However, if she were being honest, she'd rather he attacked her from the front rather than the back. Dwayne's skin crawled at her suggestive words. He shouted at her to shut up. No one wanted her used goods after all. Consumed by rage, he viciously stomped her back, trying his best to vent all his emotions from being enslaved. When that wasn't enough, he savagely stomped harder, pulling and ripping her arms off her body. Fibici felt the pain, but her cries came out as loud, sensual moans instead. She screamed that she wanted more. That savage, brutal play was one of her best kinks after all. As she lost herself to the ecstasy of the Big O, a subtle voice called out, saying it had what she wanted. Fibici immediately lifted her flushed face, a look of anticipation in her eyes. She cast her gaze upwards, seemingly inviting the voice to bring on the painful pleasure. Jeong said, "Bet," and instantly lunged at her. He performed a mid-air somersault, driving his heel into her skull. The force pinned the masochistic baddie into the ground, her face buried deep beneath the rubble. Just as Jeong was about to celebrate his victory, a long, wet tongue slithered up his leg, licking and trailing over his foot. Jeong said, "Fuck that," and immediately backpedaled. Inasmuch as he wanted to explore what that tongue could do, he knew he had to keep Not's video PG. However, he guessed it was still alright to check out them boobs, 'cause god damn. Dwayne shot Jeong a knowing smile before asking what was wrong. Why didn't he seem pleased in the face of such deliciousness? Jeong replied that he was pleased, but that's not what's important right now. Fibici, that wench, was still alive, even after losing her head. In fact, she even licked his foot, even though he had no idea how she managed that without a face. Dwayne's skin crawled at the reply. How could she lick without a head? I mean, if it was without teeth, then he'd understand. But head? How was that possible? Just as he was mulling it over, Fibici's sultry voice rang out, screaming that she loved it. She slowly rose from the ground, taking breaks to squirm in ecstasy. Under the Chad's incredulous gazes, the maiden fully rose, her voice growing louder and louder. She shouted at them to give her more pain, more pleasure. She wanted all of it. When the Chads didn't respond to her calls, she stared at them, fixated, as a wave of frustration flowed through her. Fine. If they didn't want to give her pleasure, then she guessed it was her turn to do the same. She couldn't keep taking without reciprocating after all. However, before she did so, it was only right that she put on something more enticing. A little feast for the eyes would make the service better, after all. Saying so, her skin promptly burst open, and from within came the newly reborn Fibici. All her injuries were gone, and a pair of butterfly wings graciously nestled behind her. With her transformation complete, Fibici cast her gaze towards the duo. She sensually whispered to them, inviting the boys to play with her. Contrary to her ecstatic mood, our boys were currently losing their shit. Dwayne, in particular, was flabbergasted as he gawked at her wings. Since when did this wench become a flying wench? It made no sense. Jeong, on the other hand, was more worried about her recovery. The metamorphosis had not only healed her injuries, but also restored her clothing. If it was that thorough, then there was no way it could only be used once. Fuck. This was starting to be a drag. Fibichi, clearly oblivious to their thoughts, dove in for a sweep attack, officially beginning the hunting game. The Chads scrambled to dodge, barely getting out of the way on time. They then turned their gazes to the flying beauty, shocked by how fast she was. Fibichi noticed their tense expressions and chuckled slightly. What? Were they scared already? They shouldn't be, because she still had a lot of fun to have with them. Jeong glared at the maiden and, like many times before, ignored her taunts. He focused on her speed and the subtle change in the smell around them. Sure, he wasn't certain about the latter, but his ample experience in L.A.G warned him to be careful nonetheless. Just as he was thinking of ways to counter Phoebus's ludicrous speed, Dwayne suddenly called out to him, saying that his arm was itchy. Jeong turned to check and was shocked to see a bone sticking out of Dwayne's arm. The duo immediately grew tense because neither of them had seen it happen. In fact, if it wasn't for the weird itchiness, they wouldn't have found out at all. Jeong glanced at the broken bone and cautiously sniffed the air. He already had a suspicion about what was going on, but he had to tend to Dwayne first. With a concerned gaze, he called out to the unit, asking if he was okay. Dwayne didn't reply, but the painful grunts were more than enough to answer Jeong's question. Jeong cast a furious glare at Fibichi. This bitch, she couldn't have done what he was thinking, right? Surely she couldn't have done something so ridiculous, right? If so, then damn, they really were cooked. Dwayne picked up on Jeong's worry and flicked his gaze toward him. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but before he could, the throbbing in his arm intensified, forcing his gaze away. Jeong noticed this and hurried to his side. He worriedly asked Dwayne if he was all right and why he was suddenly whining like a bitch. Dwayne replied that he wasn't sure, but for some reason, an explosion suddenly went off in his arm. Jeong looked at him incredulously. An explosion? Out of nowhere at that? It seemed his speculation was true then. This bitch really went and did it, didn't she? He cast a resentful glare at Fibichi, his frustration evident. Ignoring the flying wench for now, Jeong shifted his gaze to his arm. Just as he'd expected, there were fine purple particles floating around it. These were the cause of the explosions just now. Little explosive dust shed by Fibici. She cast them during her flight, making her own version of pixie landmines. Jeong frowned at this sight, clearly frustrated by how things were developing. They not only had to look out for the incredibly fast Fibici, but also actively avoid the mines in the air. Damn, things sure were getting troublesome. Just as he was racking his brain for a solution, the dust on his arm suddenly exploded, ripping open a wound. Jeong snapped out of his thoughts and immediately backpedaled. He shouted at Dwayne to do the same, warning him to be extra careful of the purple dust. Dwayne didn't hesitate and backed away instantly. He shot Jeong a puzzled glance, clearly seeking an explanation. Jeong didn't hide anything and shared his speculations. He told Dwayne about the pixie dust and how he suspected they were the cause of the explosions. For now, his belief was that they penetrated the skin and exploded upon contact with their blood. Dwayne visibly paled at that revelation. A whole room full of microbombs. How the hell were they supposed to avoid that? Jeong thought about it, but he couldn't come up with a definite plan. His best bet was to actively avoid the dust, but obviously, that was easier said than done. If they couldn't even see the little bastards, then how were they supposed to avoid them? Damn it, why was everything going to shit all of a sudden? As he was still cursing their shitty luck, Fibichi's sultry voice rang out, asking if they'd forgotten about her. She quickly dove at them, forcing the duo to dodge. Although they managed to avoid the main charge, there was still the issue of the dust. Just as they'd expected, small explosions tore at their bodies, ripping open wounds. Jeong noticed this and cursed even more. This bitch, why was she so damn fast? And if she was already that fast, how were they supposed to avoid the dust? Wasn't this asking for too much? For a split second, he considered smashing her like she wanted. Maybe that would finally get her to come down. However, after mulling it over, he decided against it. He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. Like hell, he'd surrender the cheeks to a foe. If she wanted a piece of that ass, then she had to come down and take it. No diddy, of course. Locking back in, Jeong shouted his instructions to Dwayne. He told the Chad to split up because staying together would only put them in danger. Dwayne agreed and ran in the opposite direction. He didn't even hesitate because he knew this was the best solution. Fibichi, however, stared at them with a look of interest. She had a teasing smile on her lips, almost as if she was enjoying a show. Fine. Things were better this way. If the duo wanted to amuse her with a game of hide-and-seek, then she'd definitely oblige. She instantly picked a target, who unfortunately turned out to be the homie Dwayne. Dwayne saw her trailing him and immediately cursed. Damn, why couldn't she have gone for Jeong instead? In such a situation, wasn't it only logical to go for the bigger dog? Fibichi heard his ramblings and cursed him out. Why the hell would she go for the top G when there was a slowpoke on the team? Dwayne better stop with that nonsense before she caramelized his ass. Oh, and just so he knew, she didn't need him anymore. It was about time she got rid of his scaredy ass. Saying so, she let that thing out, and I shit you not, she was a Bruce Jenner in this bitch. As if that wasn't enough, the thing grew, morphing into a dick spear or some shit. Dwayne saw this and said hell no. What in the F was going on in L.A.G? Not to mention, this wench was packing more heat than him. Since when did that become an acceptable thing? He stood there dazed, too stunned to make a move. Jeong spawned beside him and kicked him out of the way. He yelled at Dwayne to focus. Didn't he see that big dong of destruction? If he continued to space out like that, then he wouldn't be there to save him from the next smash. Pause. Fibichi paused midair and let that thing hang. She told Jeong to stay out of it unless he wanted a piece of her schlong too. Jeong gulped and said, hell no. Who in their right mind would want something like that? In fact, he was beginning to doubt the author, because what in the fuck was going on? Fibichi chuckled, then glared at him. Fine. If he really insisted on interfering, then she had no choice but to stroke him down. He shouldn't blame her though, because he came looking for this pipe on his own. Jeong said bet and braced for her charge. However, halfway through her attack, he couldn't help but sweat and worry. Was it just him, or was this wench much faster than before? Not to mention, that schlong was really weighing down on his psyche. Why the hell was it so large? His bravado instantly crumbled, and he didn't hesitate to hide in the shadows. When he next appeared, he realized he'd messed up and had fallen right into Fibichi's trap. The wench was never after him. Her real target had been Dwayne all along. She'd anticipated he'd hide in the shadows, giving her direct access to Dwayne. Jeong cursed at his oversight, but by then it was already too late. Fibichi was already on Dwayne, and there was nothing he could do about it. Dwayne also noticed this and stopped fleeing. Since he couldn't get back up, he might as well make his last stand. He shouted at Fibichi to come at him. He'd rather die on his feet than be poked in the back. Pause. Fibichi grinned, then sped up. She rammed into the unit, her gigantic schlong poking out from the back. Dwayne was flung by the momentum, crashing heavily into the pedestal. He immediately recovered, checking his body for any signs of the obvious. Luckily, he found none, meaning he'd avoided the schlong in time. But damn, that sure was a close call. Fibichi noticed Dwayne's current position, and her face visibly tensed. She shouted at him to get out of there, otherwise she'd kill him. This intense reaction drew Jeong's attention. He wondered why she was reacting like that, especially after maintaining her cool throughout the fight. No matter what they did to her, she always maintained her calm. So why was she acting out now? Did it have something to do with the pedestal? She did tell Dwayne to get out of there, after all. Observing it keenly, Jeong realized it wasn't a pedestal, but a coffin. And for whatever reason, this coffin was making the wench very uneasy. Trusting in his instincts, Jeong shouted at Dwayne to open the coffin. He didn't know what lay within, but so long as it made Fibichi restless, then it was something they could use. Fibichi heard Jeong's shout, and her face tensed even more. She charged at Dwayne, screaming at him to leave the coffin alone. Of course, Dwayne didn't listen. He obediently opened the coffin, finding a little girl inside. Dwayne stared at the girl in shock. What the hell was she doing there? And why was she sleeping peacefully in such an ominous place? Nothing made sense. Behind him was Fibichi, who continued her charge, a visible panic in her eyes. She shouted at Dwayne to back away. He shouldn't even think of touching her. Jeong picked up on Fibichi's panic, and all the puzzles finally fit together. This little girl, whoever she was the true body of Fibichi. The version they'd been fighting was nothing but a shell, a disposable pawn she could discard at any time. No wonder she could tank their attacks and didn't seem bothered no matter how much they wounded her. She knew her true body was safe, so why would she worry about a clone? When he came to that conclusion, Jeong immediately sprang into action. He screamed at Dwayne to kill her, informing him that that was the true body. Dwayne agreed and immediately cocked his hand back. He prepared his strongest attack, aiming to finish her in one go. However, when he looked at her young face, he couldn't help but falter. Was this really the right move? No matter how he looked at it, she was a child, and he couldn't bring himself to harm her. Jeong noticed his hesitation, and his rage exploded. He shouted at Dwayne to kill her. Now wasn't the time for that shit. Dwayne heard Jeong's desperate shouts, but his body didn't move. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill a child. He weakly lowered his arms, seemingly accepting his fate. Behind him was Fibichi, who finally caught up to him. She charged at him with fury, her dick spear raised for the stab. Jeong's desperation thickened at the sight. He yelled like a rabid dog, telling Dwayne to kill her. Damn it. Why was he even hesitating? Didn't he know how dire the situation was? Why would he pick such a time to grow a conscience? Fuck. To fully understand why Dwayne was hesitating, we take a quick trip down memory lane. He, like most gigapoppies, had a family, parents, and a younger sibling. After the passing of his parents, his only family in the world was his younger sister, who of course required him to step up. However, the Dwayne from back then wasn't the same unit we currently know. He was a no-good bastard who could only be referred to as a waste of space. He neglected his sister, ignored his responsibilities, and didn't even bother to put in the effort expected of him. Eventually, and predictably, something happened. And of course, Dwayne wasn't there to protect his sister. She passed away, leaving Dwayne alone in this world. Well, he did have his unending guilt, but that was nowhere near enough to fill the bottomless pit of loneliness and despair her passing had created. Now, back to the present. When Dwayne saw the helpless little girl lying in the coffin, he couldn't bring himself to harm her. No matter how he tried to rationalize it, his body refused to move, seemingly expressing the unwillingness in his heart. Sure, it was foolish, and deep down he knew she was nothing but a monster. But when have emotions ever been rational? It is within human nature to be swept up in our feelings and end up doing some dumb shit. Thus, when he looked at that young face, Dwayne already knew he'd lost. He couldn't kill her, even though he knew not doing so would doom them both. Unfortunately, Phoebus wasn't magnanimous enough to spare him in lieu of his momentary weakness. She proceeded with the attack, inching closer and closer to Dwayne. Jeong, who was already losing his shit at this point, shouted even louder, warning Dwayne to be careful. He screamed at him to take cover, to protect himself even if he couldn't kill the girl. Obviously, Dwayne didn't hear any of that, further intensifying the worry in his heart. He just stood there, motionless, almost as if he'd given up on life. Jeong saw this, and the anger in his heart flared. Fine. If he didn't want to save himself, then he'd have no choice but to save him himself. He shot forward swiftly, making sure to take the biggest gamble since the regression. Official unlock, Gate 4 open. Buffed by the tremendous power boost, Jeong launched forward like a rocket, cracking the very floor beneath him. He swiftly caught up to the attacking Fibichi, yeeting the bricked-up bitch to the side. With that done, Jeong didn't hesitate to deactivate the fourth door. Although he'd only used it for a split second, the recoil was still tremendous, leaving Jeong on the brink of death. He silently cursed to himself, vowing not to make such a gamble a second time. Done with the justified self-reproach, Jeong studied his body, curious to assess the extent of his injuries. He was shocked to learn that things were way worse than he'd initially imagined. Not only was his body severely battered, but his stamina was also non-existent, preventing him from using the shadow skill. For all intents and purposes, he was already a spent force. A helpless lamb free for the slaughter. Obviously, Fibichi wouldn't let go of such an opportunity. She sprang forward immediately, grabbing Jeong by the throat. Jeong too didn't go down without a fight. Since he couldn't do anything to the avatar, he directly switched his target to the real body. Using the extendable bone blade, he stabbed at the latter, aiming for a direct kill shot. Unfortunately, Lady Luck wasn't on his side this time, and his stab fell short by a mere inch. He failed to kill the main body, giving Fibichi enough time to drag him away. Just as he was thinking their bad luck had peaked, things surprisingly got worse, with Fibichi driving him toward the wall. She didn't hesitate to ram him into it, dealing a devastating blow to Jeong. Capitalizing on his momentary stun from the damage, she rushed in for a bite attack, seeking to put an end to our boy. Jeong, however, refused to go down so easily. He retaliated, slashing his blade across Phoebe's neck. Like a well-aimed guillotine, his slash cut deep, quickly cleaving half of Phoebe's throat. Phoebe picked up on his actions and laughed mockingly. Did he really think something like this would take her down? Surely he must know losing a head wasn't that big of a deal to her, right? Or did he perhaps want it for something else? Something throaty? In any case, she welcomed him to try harder. Only then would his despair be the sweetest after he inevitably failed. Oh, and he shouldn't expect help from his friend over there, because the unit was clearly out of it. He couldn't and wouldn't kill her main body, so it was best not to rely on him. Jeong glared at the boasting Phoebe, and his anger intensified. He knew she was right, but so what? So what if Dwayne was currently useless and wouldn't be coming to his rescue? So what if severing her head wouldn't kill her? Did she really think such things would stop him? Nah. He was Jeong Big Papi Hyeok. It'd take way more than that to get him to back down. Besides, thanks to her nonsense ramblings, he finally confirmed the body in the coffin was indeed her true body. Moving forward, all he had to do was kill her, and all this shit would be over. Before Phoebe could respond to his retort, Jeong slashed forward, cleanly decapitating the hoe. He then kicked her in the gut, sending her corpse crashing to the ground. As for our boy, he landed gracefully near the corpse before shooting an angry glare at Dwayne. Dwayne felt his gaze but didn't turn back to face him. He continued to stare into the coffin, a silent war waging in his heart. Damn it. What was he doing? After coming all the way, was he really going to let it end like that? Was he really going to let Jeong hang because the evil witch reminded him of his sister? He already knew what he had to do, but his stubborn body refused to move. No matter how he tried to convince himself, his heart didn't budge, leaving him rooted in place. After minutes of quiet reflection, Dwayne harshly criticized himself, almost bursting into a reproachful chuckle. Truly, what was he doing? Did he really think sparing this witch, and consequently putting his best mate in danger, counted as atonement for his actions against his sister? If he thought so, then he was gravely mistaken. Two wrongs can never make a right. Even if they ended up dying there was no way his atonement could be fulfilled. This realization dawned on Dwayne, and his eyes widened with resolve. Over at Jeong, he continued his face-off against Phoebe. Just as she'd said, losing a head wasn't that big of a deal to her. She instantly grew it back, continuing her relentless mockery of Jeong. What? Was he still unconvinced? Probably planning to struggle until the bitter end? If so, then he should get on with it. Who was she to stop such a fascinating scene? Jeong cursed at her and cocked his hand back. So what if she couldn't die? Since when has that ever stopped him? If he couldn't kill her, then it just meant he hadn't killed her enough. No matter what it took, he'd continue to kill her until he killed her unkillable ass. Bars. Phoebe smirked and told him to bring it on. She was really curious to see how long his resolve would last. Jeong didn't hesitate and let a punch fly. He too was curious to see how long Phoebe would continue acting cocky. Thus, the first hit landed, sending a thunderous bang across the room. After the first hit came the second, third, fourth, 10th, and soon, the blows faded, reduced to a cacophony of echoes in the background. When the carnage stopped, the outcome was really jarring, with half of Phoebe's body reduced to a mangled mess. As for Jeong, he stood there panting, a contemplative gleam in his eyes. He knew for a fact that much wouldn't stop her, and it was just a matter of time until she revived. If he wanted to bring her down for good, then the best move would be to get to her main body. Just as he was about to act on this, a sudden pain tore across his back, catching him completely off guard. Jeong looked down and was surprised to find a dick spear stabbing through his gut. Turns out Phoebe had been sneaky with it, hiding her D in the ground for a sudden sneak attack. And although it's unclear how it managed to dig through concrete, let's ignore it for now because that is the least troubling thing about this panel. Done with the insidious backstab, Phoebe slowly rose from the ground, a mocking grin on her lips. She watched the collapsing Jeong, not bothering to hide the disappointment in her eyes. Oh, how she would have loved to play with him further. But alas, the time for games was over. If there was ever a next time, then she hoped to play with him at that time. For now, however, it was time to die, and she had just the right tool for it. Saying so, she burst out that big mamba, sending it piercing toward Jeong. As for the Chad in question, he lay there helpless, too injured to make a move, Just as the thing was about to violate and deep-throat our boy, it suddenly stopped, hovering inches from his face. Fibichi, who had been dead set on carrying out the attack, froze as well. A disbelieving look etched on her face. She immediately turned to Dwayne, not bothering to hide the shock in her eyes. How was this possible? Had she been wrong in her assessment of the situation? It seemed so, because the unit had done the unexpected. Dwayne had broken through his trauma and finished off the main body. In fact, the move was so final that even her soul came out for the taking. Phoebus glanced at the trembling Dwayne and sighed softly. Who would have thought the unit would actually go through with it? It sure was a shame that she couldn't play some more. But hey, at least she got to bone Jeong. Her silhouette slowly faded, leaving behind her last sigh of resignation. Damn, it sure was a shame. Jeong, who had narrowly escaped death, promptly passed out, his wounds finally taking a toll on him. He was out like a light, only regaining consciousness after a significant amount of time had passed. When he did, the first thing he saw was the anxious Dwayne calling out to him. The unit was completely frantic, tears threatening to stream down his face. Jeong saw and immediately mocked Dwayne. If he'd known the first face he'd see after waking up would be his ugly mug, then he wouldn't have opened his eyes. Dwayne should at least have a baddie with him next time. Otherwise, he might as well die. Dwayne heard Jeong's diss and chuckled slightly. This was good. So long as he could joke like that, it meant he was fine. And that was more than enough for him. Jeong returned the smile and asked about Fibichi. Was she dead? Dwayne replied that she was. After he'd killed the main body, the avatar followed suit, fading away like a puff of smoke. He didn't know how it worked exactly, but so long as she was dead, he couldn't care less. Jeong accepted the outcome before asking about himself. How was he still alive? He could have sworn his injuries were definitely lethal. Dwayne replied that it was tough, but he managed to pry him from the clutches of death. The process mainly involved feeding him a shit ton of recovery potion, but at least he got to keep his life. Jeong sighed before thanking him. He'd really been lucky this time. If it wasn't for his help, then he might have really died there. Dwayne, however, didn't accept the gratitude. He instead apologized to Jeong, realizing it was his fault things had gotten that bad. Jeong told him not to worry about it. At the end of the day, he still handled business, and that's what truly mattered. Besides, he was sure he had his reasons, so why would he blame him? He told Dwayne to rest up. They'd challenge the next room after recovering. Dwayne said bet and immediately got to healing his wounds. Inwardly, however, he resolved to do better. He wouldn't allow a repeat of the same. From now on, it was an all-out clap buffet, with everyone getting their just clapping. Whether they were young or old, chads or chadlets, they would all be clapped. He was officially an all-opportunity clappiologist. Done with the self-reflection, Dwayne continued with his healing. After resting for a while, the duo recovered to some extent. Not completely, but enough to get them moving again. Dwayne, having suffered fewer injuries, was the first to get up. He quickly checked up on Jeong, scanning every inch of his body for injuries. No diddy. When he found none, he finally exhaled the breath he'd been holding the entire time. Damn, that sure was a close one. If he didn't have the healing medicine, who knows if Jeong would have made it through. Jeong picked up on his worry and reassured him. He told the Chad not to worry because he couldn't be killed that easily. Dwayne might not know this, but he was him. To say that he was invincible might be a stretch, but it also wasn't far from the truth either. In fact, the only weakness he was currently aware of was baddies. For whatever reason, he couldn't keep a bitch, almost as if he was allergic to them or something. However, such spirits of celibacy wouldn't hold him for long. So long as he kept at it, he was sure he'd make them jiggle soon enough. Fingers crossed. Dwayne looked at Jeong, or rather not, like he was an idiot. After all they'd been through, was he really talking about cheeks right now? Where were his priorities? He eyed Jeong a second time, but didn't insist further. Should they head out now? Jeong replied that they should. He was already mostly healed after all. However, now that he thought about it, he sure was lucky this time. If Dwayne had been a second late to administer the medication, then he wouldn't have survived. Healing in L.A.G wasn't guaranteed, as there was always a time frame to consider. If the potions were administered after that time frame, then healing wouldn't be possible, even if you dumped a shit ton of potions on the wound. In any case, he was lucky, so he'd leave it at that for now. Gearing up, the first thing Jeong went for was the soul. He was surprised Dwayne hadn't claimed it, but thinking back to the situation, he guessed it was only right. If the Chad had prioritized the souls instead of his best buddy, especially after it was his fuck-up that got him cooked, he would have definitely been enraged. Luckily, Dwayne was still a sensible waifu, so he didn't have anything to worry about. Locking back in, Jeong swiftly divided the souls. Fibichi had a shit ton, so each of them gained a sizable amount. In fact, Jeong's collection shot past 400, with the total amount adding up to 440. This wasn't a small amount, considering lots of upgrades required only tens of souls. If he planned it well, then he wouldn't have a shortage of souls, at least for the next room. Speaking of souls, Jeong immediately put them to use. He wasn't the type to hoard, especially in a hell like L.A.G. If he insisted on being thrifty only to die as a consequence, then even hell wouldn't be enough to hold his stupid ass. The best move would be to efficiently use the souls, prioritizing the important skills for upgrades. As for the rest, he'd level them on a need-to-use basis, with body enhancement skills taking the cake. True to this thought, Jeong instantly began his leveling spree. He first prioritized his main skills, with calm breathing, strong bones, lizard tail, and gates of limitation taking the lead. After the main skills came the secondary skills, with lightning making the cut. It was also the last skill to be upgraded this time. Don't worry about the name changes. The translators be wildin' sometimes. The skills are the same, albeit with a little twist in the names. For now, we'll stick to the original ones because that's what we've used so far. If things change, I'll definitely let you know. Back in the room, Jeong turned to face Dwayne. He promptly handed the latter healing potions, a compensation for his earlier expenditures. Dwayne thanked him, but ultimately rejected the offer. He expressed his discomfort with accepting them, especially since it was his fault to begin with. Since he'd caused the mess that necessitated the use of potions, it was only right that he bore the expenses. Jeong, however, thought otherwise. This wasn't a case of needless philanthropy, more like a strategic decision. Regardless of what Dwayne thought and whatever honor or guilt was influencing his refusal, he still had to remember this was L.A.G. No one knew what they'd face in the next room. Heck, they didn't even know if they'd make it that far. With such a volatile situation, it was only logical that he had a bunch of healing potions on deck. That way, if things hit the fan, he could at least save himself on time. Not to mention there's the whole time limit thing to consider. If he missed his window to heal just because he couldn't procure potions from Jeong on time, then it sure would be a foolish way to go. Dwayne accepted the logic and promptly retrieved the potions. Since the big poppy was offering, why would he refuse? Besides, there were no strings attached, so why would he hesitate? This wasn't an invitation to a ditty party after all. Baby oil. Done with prep, the duo turned to face the door. It had appeared after Fibichi fell, so they were certain it was the exit door. Jeong didn't waste time and swiftly made a beeline for it. He resolutely walked out, leaving Dwayne behind. The unit, however, stayed rooted in place, a contemplative look in his eyes. He cast his gaze upon the coffin, conflicted emotions hidden in their depths. He still remembered the ordeal and what he'd done to survive it. Sure, she was a monster, but that didn't make the feeling better. No matter what, this was another guilt he had to carry. Sighing at his misfortune, Dwayne did a double-take before turning around. This was still L.A.G, so he couldn't afford to be emotional. If he ever made it out alive, then he'd have more than enough time to sort out his feelings. For now, however, it was time to lock in and shove those feelings to the side. He resolutely walked out, shutting the door with a bang behind him. When he joined Jeong, he found the former in a dark room. The room was somewhat similar to the last, with the obvious absence of humping going on. That was undoubtedly a good thing, because he couldn't deal with that shit again. Who knows, maybe this time he wouldn't be lucky and have his back blown out. It definitely was a possibility in a hell like L.A.G. Completely oblivious to Dwayne's wild thoughts, Jeong suggested moving forward. Since the lights still hadn't come on yet, it just meant they weren't in the right place. If his guess was correct, then the actual site of the trial should be up ahead. Dwayne didn't argue and silently walked forward. He knew Jeong was the pro in these matters, so why would he doubt him? Besides, his mind was still in chaos after the last room, so the last thing he needed was to overthink. He silently followed Jeong, and soon their adventure bore fruit. Well, more like rotten fruit, because their discoveries were mangled corpses. Before them was a graveyard full of mutilated corpses. The air was also filled with the stench of death. If the duo didn't know better, they'd probably think this was a battlefield. However, from their experience, mostly Jeong's experience, they knew this wasn't the work of humans. Some creature, probably a vile one, was responsible for this mess. Dwayne took in the sight and sighed slightly. This was L.A.G, a place where your life was never your own. If you made any mistakes or were just unlucky, you might find yourself in a room similar to this. Dead and with a mutilated corpse. It sure was a shame. Controlling his emotions, he turned to Jeong. What should they do now? Jeong replied that it was obvious. They'd continue moving forward. Although he didn't know what had caused this mess, and he also believed it was probably waiting for them at their destination, they still had no choice but to move forward. Staying there wasn't an option, after all. Dwayne said bet and continued their journey. Since they were already in this shit, what did they have to fear? They might as well move with confidence and tackle the obstacles as they appear. After walking for a while, the duo finally saw light from up ahead. The ground was still littered with corpses, so they knew things would definitely get dicey. Jeong took the lead and walked towards the light. He warned Dwayne to be careful because he could hear the sound of fighting from up ahead. Dwayne nodded before locking in. He could also hear the faint screams of pain, causing his steps to involuntarily falter. He really didn't want any part of that shit, but what choice did he have? If he didn't embrace the smoke, then the smoke would embrace him. And since that was the case, he might as well go hard. They bravely entered the light, finding themselves in the true zone of the trial. They'd already prepared mentally, but the scene before them still left them surprised. The place was pure mayhem, with humans and insects engaged in a deadly tango. Bodies dropped like flies, yet some resisted, continuing their desperate dance for survival. Some, however, weren't as lucky, and soon found themselves with fates worse than death. Jeong took in the sight and breathed deeply. Damn, he already knew this wouldn't be easy. If they had to fight their way through a swarm of giant insects, then this room was shaping up to be way worse than the last. At least in that room, they could see some titties, even if they were attached to a bona fide psycho. Damn, they sure were unlucky. Speaking of insects, this scene kinda reminded him of when he used to collect insects as a kid. He especially liked stag beetles, finding them cool. Dwayne looked at Jeong incredulously. Was he serious? After seeing such a bloodbath, all he could think about was the insects he collected during his childhood. Did he have a screw loose or something? On second thought, he should forget everything he just said. He's just glad he's more normal than he is. Jeong returned the gaze, a confused look in his eyes. What did he mean more normal than him? Did he forget he was a sex slave literally a couple of hours ago? Not to mention he persistently chased him down wanting to partake in the cheeks. If he called that normal, then Jada Smith is the Afro Queen. That aside, they should probably focus, because they seem to have company. Dwayne said bet before acknowledging the threat. First of all, he should keep his wife's name out of his mouth. Second, was it just him? Or was this be a big boy? Jeong replied that it was. In fact, all the insects in the room were giant versions of the original. It truly wasn't an exaggeration to call them big boys. But again, like he said before, they should probably focus. He swiftly dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a sneak attack by the bee. Dwayne did the same and watched it fly by. However, the previously relaxed smile on his face completely disappeared after that attack. The reason? The bee was insanely fast. In fact, if he hadn't reacted on time, then he might have been cooked. Luckily, he did so. And his speed wasn't to be underestimated either. Jeong also felt the same as he traced the bee with his eyes. Sure, it was fast, but not to the point where he couldn't react. If he played it cool, then he wouldn't have that big of a problem taking them down. Speaking of bees, it seemed its ridiculous speed wasn't all positive. It particularly made flying difficult, causing it to crash into the wall. Obviously, the CHADY duo wouldn't let go of such a chance. Dwayne shot forward, landing a nasty punch on the pest. After finishing it off, he turned to Jeong. That definitely was way harder than he thought it'd be. Jeong looked at him incredulously. Did he think the giant size was just for show? Of course the insect bastards would have more resilience than their normal counterparts. However, durability aside, the main issue was still their speed. If they weren't careful, then they might really be poked in this room. Pause. Just as they were ironing out their battle plan, a stranger came crashing in, drawing their attention. The poor fool had been yeeted all the way there, making for a rather odd yet hilarious scene. After noticing the duo, and also taking into account his pathetic situation, the Chad couldn't help but cough awkwardly. He stiffly greeted the boys, asking if they were new there. Jeong stared at the fool, then ignored him completely. If he had to team up with such idiots, then he might as well offer his cheeks to the bees. Speaking of idiot, his real name was Kim Min-jun. His public attribute was a flexible body, which for sure came in handy with Phoebishi. And if he didn't stroke her down, then I can only say, it's one hell of a waste. Kim noticed the duo's odd gazes but ignored them completely. Why would he linger on such an awkward topic? Instead, he asked for their help. The insects were way more than they could handle, so a bit of help would be appreciated. He wanted to plead some more, but an anguished scream came from the front, forcing him to dive back in. The scream was from his partner, who was currently getting that gawk from a beetle. Obviously this was the toothy kind, so you pervs better not get any ideas. Jeong watched him go and sighed slightly. It seemed they had no choice but to join the fight. Even if they ended up killing each other later, the best move at the moment would be to join forces and fight together. Dwayne agreed with that suggestion. Since things had developed like that, then they might as well go with the flow. He told Jeong he'd handle the pest on the right, so Jeong should deal with the one on the left. Jeong said bet and immediately sprang into action. Over at the battlefield, the fool Kim was going hard, literally. He called upon his hammer, crashing down on the beetle. However, he was clearly not the MC, so his attack did nothing. In fact, he even suffered a rebound, forcing him to withdraw. Just as he was cursing the tanky bastard, a red blur zoomed past him, making a beeline for the beetle. The blur was obviously the unit Dwayne, who had his MC music playing. Kim must not have heard the music, because he urged Dwayne to withdraw. Dwayne, however, wasn't perturbed by his nonsense. He continued his charge, bashing the shit out of the beetle. Thanks to the buff from the MC music, the beetle was sent flying, causing Kim to buzz out in shock. He stared in a daze, wondering why the author didn't give him that sauce as well. Damn, it sure was tragic to be a bot character. Over at Jeong, he began his preparations as well. Since the unit Dwayne had already led by example, he couldn't be a bitch and fall behind. He immediately activated his third door, letting the demonic buff envelop him. After the door came the lightning skill, which had significantly changed after its upgrade. Not only were the bolts golden, but the buff on the body was different as well. The buff no longer functioned on a superficial level, but instead dug deeper into the fundamentals. In fact, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that the bolts were mixed with his very core. More specifically, his blood and heart. The lightning accelerated the flow of his blood and the pumping of his heart, causing a more potent effect during the buff. In essence, it sped up his blood flow, resulting in an overall enhancement of physical power. Without a doubt, the upgrade caused a qualitative change, making the skill way better than before. Back on the battlefield, we are introduced to a new character. This time it's a baddie, so let's hope she sticks around for a while. However, judging by the perilous situation she's currently in, I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you. Anyway, the maiden was still holding her own, successfully keeping 3 bees at bay. She even had time to be distracted, foolishly checking up on her friend. Turns out the other maiden, Wemby, had been careless, causing her to get stung by the bee. The sting was obviously deadly, resulting in her body swelling up and passing out in the midst of convulsions. The new baddie definitely learned from this mistake and had been avoiding the bee's stinger all this time. However, for how long she could keep that shit up, even she couldn't tell. Just as she avoided another drive-by by the bees, a new party joined the fray, bringing hope to her perilous situation. The party was obviously Jeong, who'd seen a waifu and came rushing with the quickness. He charged in like a lightning god, ready to secure a maiden, and if he was lucky, then maybe, just maybe, he might actually procure some cheeks. Fingers crossed. As for the maiden, she wasn't your typical damsel in distress. Nah, she could hold her own, managing to weave through the bees with ease. Just like a dancer, she let her blade fly, slashing at the pests with finesse. However, due to the numbers disadvantage, she couldn't get a proper opening to land a solid hit. All her strikes were half-baked, merely bouncing off the bee's chitin. She didn't give up, though. She continued her relentless barrage, landing every hit the opportunity allowed. Just as she finished another fruitless attack, a bee suddenly snuck up on her, launching its own sneak attack. The unexpected move caught CHADY off guard, leaving her stunned and helpless to resist. Her future suddenly became bleak, and all hopes of survival instantly vanished. She stared wide in resignation, seemingly already picturing a gruesome death. However, what CHADY didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Matter of fact, a Chad in shining armor was already in the fray, shooting towards her with the momentum of 1,000 virgins. He shot in like a lightning god, stabbing the absolute shit out of the bee. Thanks to his overwhelming momentum, or maybe his desire to save a maiden, the strike was lethal enough to pin the bee to the ground, making a complete mess of the floor. Of course, Jeong didn't care about that. He treated it as yet another Tuesday, another day to aura farm and bag some baddies. CHADY, however, thought otherwise. When she saw Jeong descend like a Greek deity, consequently saving her in the process, she already knew she was hooked. This was it. This was exactly what she'd been waiting for. A handsome poppy saving her like she was a damsel or something. Which she was. She blushed deeply, her face taking on a pinkish hue. Just as she was about to confess her love on the spot, a silhouette caught her attention, forcing her face to change. She called out to Jeong, an audible worry evident in her tone. Damn it, he was so handsome she'd lost her wits for a split second. And because of that, it was too late to warn him of the danger behind. Nevertheless, she had to try. Otherwise this juicy unit of a poppy would die a miserable death. She called out to her darling. Yes, she actually said that, warning him to look out. Jeong, who was at first confused by her nonsense, swiftly reacted, erecting a lightning shield to protect himself. He safely blocked the attack, causing the bee to bounce back in fury. As for CHADY, she was already on the move, jumping forward to save her man. First, she slobbed that thing, giving Jeong a glimpse of his future. Next, she let her blade sing, cleanly decapitating the pesky bastard. When it was all said and done, only a corpse remained, its head sent flying off into the distance. Jeong observed this and wanted to comment, but the look on CHADY's face made him pause. Why the hell was she looking at him like that? And was that a faint blush he saw? Yep. It definitely was a blush, because the maiden CHADY had fallen hard. In fact, she confessed it on the spot, openly begging Jeong to date her. However, Jeong wasn't a simp and quickly put her in her place. He told her to focus. They were still in a battle, after all. CHADY nodded but didn't back down. Why would she, when she was talking about love? As far as she was concerned, the bee could shove it. Her only priority was the poppy beside her. However, she wasn't unreasonable either, so she'd save the topic for later. When they were done clapping cheeks, they'd talk about their cheeks clapping. Jeong should look forward to it, because her mouth was the real deal. For talking, of course. Jeong looked at her incredulously. Was this bitch for real? No. He shouldn't even bother with her because such psychos were bound to appear in L.A.G. For now, his main focus should be the enemy before him. He swiftly shot forward, shoving CHADY's nonsense to the side. Since the horny baddie didn't want to fight, he might as well handle it on his own. Calling upon his bone blade, Jeong prepared to slash at the bee. The scene should have been epic, but alas, CHADY's bullshit still rumbled from the background. She told Jeong to take her in, promising to be slick with the tongue. And if that wasn't enough for him, then she'd feed him a buffet of cheeks. Cheeks galore. I know it sounds like I'm making this shit up, but I swear it's actually canon. In fact, it's so ridiculous that even the translators commented on it. The author was definitely without going through that drought. Bars. Jeong ignored everything and slashed at the bee. However, due to the sloppy-toppy temptation, his strike was less than desirable. He failed to land a critical hit, causing the bee to zoom past him. As for the new target, it was obviously the horny CHADY, who was still spewing her nonsense in the background. Jeong saw this, and his mouth twitched. This woman, couldn't she read the room? Why would she insist on cheeks when her life was in danger? Or could it be that her sloppy was the toppiest? In any case, she should still dodge. Otherwise he wouldn't get to know how that felt like. CHADY drew her sword and smiled at him. That look. Could it be that he was worried about her? Well, he shouldn't be, because she wasn't like the typical maidens. She was her, and she could take care of herself. She immediately raised her sword, giving it a nice slob for the buff. Once that was done, she let the blade sing, cleanly slashing the bee in two. After it fell, she turned to Jeong, an obvious smug expression on her face. What? Why was he looking at her like that? Could it be that he thought she was weak? A damsel in need of saving? Nah, she could protect herself. Otherwise, she wouldn't have made it that far. But then again, a little bit of company wouldn't hurt. If he took her in, then she'd give him everything she promised and much more. All she needed was a yes, and she'd lay that thing on him. Jeong looked at her silently, clearly not bothered to indulge in her fantasies. He knew the maiden was down bad, so any move to reason with her would be pointless. CHADY, however, interpreted his silence as shyness. She encouraged him to speak up. There was no need to hide it if he liked her after all. Oh, and in case he was hesitant about the location, he shouldn't be. She was down to smash if he was. Speaking of smash, how did he like it? Did he like it cute or sexy, or perhaps a blend of both? He shouldn't hold back, because she could accommodate anything. Well, almost anything. She couldn't guarantee it if his taste was, bizarre. Again, I'd like to emphasize that this isn't me bullshitting. The dialogue is actually canon, so you chads and chadlets better not be thinking I'm thirsty. Well, I am, but that's beside the point. At least for now, I'm genuinely innocent. Back to the story. Just as the maiden was shooting her shot, a bee suddenly shot at her, aiming for her head. The attack was so fast and unexpected that she couldn't even react to it. Luckily, Jeong was still in the fray, so he swiftly intervened to save her thirsty ass. He blocked the stinger, deftly parrying it against his bone blade. With a tone that bore no warmth, he told CHADY to stop fucking around. He wasn't interested, so she should keep it pushing with that bullshit. CHADY, however, completely ignored him. She already liked him, so why would she stop now? Besides, he'd saved her twice already. What else could that be if not fate? Jeong heard her nonsense and sighed slightly. Damn, why was she such a pain in the ass? If he'd known she was this thirsty, then he wouldn't have saved her in the first place. That aside, he should probably ignore this perv and go help Dwayne out. Who knows what hell he's currently going through. He promptly cast his gaze to the side, evidently shocked by what he saw. The beetle was still alive, actively chasing after its prey. This fool in particular had the worst of it, with the beetle relentlessly chasing him down. Of course, he didn't take it with grace. Rather, he shouted like a bee, begging to be saved. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, help finally arrived, crashing down on the beetle. To the side was another red streak, which also intervened, charging headfirst into the foe. Thanks to the pincer attack, the beetle finally stopped, giving the poor fool a new lease on life. Unfortunately, the lease quickly expired, and the beetle continued its relentless pursuit. The fool noticed this and immediately tucked tail to flee. He ran like crazy, consequently cursing the beetle for singling him out. Why did it have to be him? Couldn't it go after the rest? Dwayne, who was watching from the sidelines, turned his puzzled gaze to Kim. Why was the beetle singling out the bastard? Did they have history or something? Kim replied that it wasn't history, more like how the beetle was designed. For whatever reason, it only picked one target and would continue to pursue them until they died. During that time, it would ignore everything else, even if you dropped a hammer on it. Dwayne smirked at the intel. Single targets, huh? He could already picture more than one way to exploit that. However, before he did so, they should probably pray for the poor fool, because he seemed to be cooked. True to his words, the bastard was gone, chomped and swallowed like a steak. His blood pooled on the floor, hinting at how tragic it was. Kim saw this and cursed loudly. Damn, that was the 20th person already. If they don't bring that bastard down, then they'll definitely die there. Dwayne agreed, but his mind was focused on something else. Since the beetle had slain its target, didn't it mean it would be choosing new prey? What were the odds that the pick would be him? Surely he couldn't be that unlucky, right? As if L.A.G was laughing at him, the beetle slowly turned, fixing its eyes on him. It gave Dwayne a low shriek, seemingly saying, "Yes, bitch, it's you." Dwayne returned the gaze, his brow slick with sweat. Damn, how could he be so unlucky? If anything, he blamed Jeong, because this was some MC bullshit. Shit. He really hoped that Beetle Hawk 2 was worth it at least. With zero hesitation, Dwayne turned tail to book it. Why wouldn't he when things had gotten that dire? However, what he didn't expect was that the beetle would be all up on him like cakes on a thick mommy. It chased him down, barely missing him by an inch when it crashed into the wall. Dwayne jumped from the debris and immediately cursed wildly. Damn it, Was it just him, or was this beetle way faster than before? He sure hoped not, otherwise he'd truly be flamed. He instantly fled faster, doing his best to barely stay alive. However, after the next narrow dodge, Dwayne couldn't help but admit it to himself. He was cooked. If he didn't get any help, then he'd definitely die there. Frantic and desperate, Dwayne jumped to the side, narrowly avoiding a follow-up charge by the beetle. What he didn't dodge, however, was the ensuing spit attack, as that caught him completely off guard. He'd never expected such an attack, and as a result, was trapped, helpless to escape his current predicament. Kim, who'd been watching from the sidelines, shouted at him to be careful, warning him to pay extra attention to the beetle's spit. He said it with so much sincerity, you'd almost forget Dwayne was already trapped by the damn thing. Dwayne, however, couldn't forget. He furiously shouted back, telling the latter his warning came too late. If he wanted to warn someone, then he'd best do it before they fell for the damn trap. Scared and helpless, Dwayne sighed in resignation as he was dragged toward the beetle's open maw. It wasn't that he didn't want to fight. He simply couldn't, as the beetle's spit held him firmly in place. His future was no longer in his hands, and all he could do now was pray for a miracle. You know what they say, good things come to those who wait. Just as Dwayne was praying for his miracle, a Chad in shining armor appeared, quickly slashing at the Beetlejuice. He severed it in a single slash, successfully saving the trapped Dwayne. Dwayne didn't hesitate and immediately backpedaled, warning Jeong to do the same. He then told him about the Beetlejuice, emphasizing just how troublesome it was. Jeong listened to his warning and frowned slightly. If it was really as troublesome as Dwayne said, then this hunt was definitely going to be annoying. But even still, he couldn't back down. So he might as well figure out an effective battle plan. With that in mind, Jeong asked Dwayne for all the info he had on the beetle. Dwayne replied that it wasn't much before proceeding to share all that he knew. He told Jeong about the beetle's absurd defense, and how regular attacks didn't even faze it. Jeong pondered on the intel for a while before coming up with a plausible strategy. They'd aim for the belly. Since the beetle's shell made frontal assault useless, it was only logical that they went for the underside. Who knows? Maybe that would be its weakness, and even if it wasn't, then the underside would definitely be weaker than the top shell. Dwayne said bet, and immediately volunteered his help. Since Jeong wanted to attack the underbelly, then he'd create an opening for him. Although he wasn't confident in facing the beetle head-on, creating an opening was something he could definitely do. Jeong thanked him, then instantly locked in. With Dwayne handling that part of the plan, he knew he could trust him to accomplish it flawlessly. As for himself, he'd get to work too, because the beetle was already on the move. Jeong took 2 steps forward and instantly attracted the beetle's aggro. He knew the beetle would soon switch back to Dwayne, so he had to be fast. Without hesitation, he called upon his electric blast, zapping the shit out of the beetle. The beetle shook for a while before tanking the blow. It then ignored Jeong completely, searching the room for its true prey, Dwayne. However, no matter where it looked, Dwayne was gone, almost as if he'd faded into thin air. All it could see was Jeong, who didn't hesitate to mock it. Was it looking for Dwayne? If so, then it should check to the side because the homie was coming in for a bashful reunion. True to Jeong's taunt, Dwayne was charging in for a bash attack, his shoulder poised for the smash. He tanked through the beetle's spit juice, finding zero challenge in that endeavor. When he was close enough, Dwayne dropped even lower, aiming for the beetle's head. He then channeled his momentum before shooting straight into the towering behemoth. The two clashed with a sickening crunch as the beetle was sent flying into the air. It flew high for a creature of its size, showing just how strong Dwayne was. However, despite the monstrous strength, it wasn't enough to accomplish the real goal. The true aim was to topple it over, but the strike fell short in that regard. Because of that, the beetle was set to land, and the unlucky Dwayne would be caught up in the onslaught. To make matters worse, even if he survived the crash, he still had to start all over again. And who knows? Maybe next time things wouldn't go as smoothly as they'd done this time. Just as Dwayne was beginning to despair, Kim finally joined the fray, lunging straight for the beetle. He called up his soul hammer, yeeting the beetle with it. Thanks to his timely assist, the beetle finally toppled, crashing hard on its back. It lay there like a wet dog, unable to save itself. Obviously, Jeong wouldn't let go of such an opportunity. He immediately jumped into the fray, sinking his huge axe into the beetle's belly. The creature let out an anguished shriek, but it did nothing to stop Jeong. he instead doubled his assault, digging the axe deeper into the beetle's gut. Just as he was about to cleave it in half, the creature finally retaliated, catching him completely off guard. It manifested a bunch of slippery tentacles, which it promptly smashed at Jeong. Jeong saw this, and his expression changed drastically. He'd already expected the beetle to have a defensive mechanism, but he hadn't thought it would be this sinister. Without a doubt, this would be troublesome, especially with how sturdy those tentacles looked. Dwayne, who also picked up on this point, charged in to assist, but was quickly forced to retreat by the tentacles. They launched a relentless barrage on anyone who came close, effectively isolating Jeong from his party. Speaking of Jeong, he was currently under immense pressure, with numerous tentacles whipping at him. They attacked relentlessly, giving him no chance to counterattack, let alone dodge. After suffering through the onslaught, Jeong realized something that made his blood chill. He couldn't escape from this. With how much pressure the tentacles were putting on him and his electric shield, he knew for a fact he wouldn't be able to save himself. Not only that, his skills were also beginning to fail, a consequence of the tremendous pressure he was under. Noticing Jeong's dire situation, Dwayne rushed in to assist, but was yeeted once again. He failed to penetrate the beetle's D, leaving Jeong alone without any backup. As the severity of the situation worsened, a silhouette suddenly shot forward, coming to Jeong's rescue. The silhouette was obviously CHADY, who didn't hesitate to spout some down bad bullshit. She said something about protecting her man, but honestly, I was too focused on her lack of cheeks to even care. The beetle, however, cared very much as it shot its tentacles at her. It launched a relentless barrage, doing its best to bring the young maiden down. Luckily, this isn't that type of story, so the tentacles didn't violate the baddie. She easily weaved through them, finding zero challenge in the endeavor. Jeong, who felt the pressure on him decrease significantly, shot an appreciative gaze at CHADY before locking all the fuck in. He immediately opened his fourth door, letting the oppressive aura spread across the room. Utilizing the power boost, he struck at the beetle, causing a deafening explosion to go off. The force from the blast tore through the air, flinging Jeong away like a ragdoll. When he finally settled, he immediately deactivated his fourth door, doing his best to minimize the backlash. Luckily, it hadn't been that long, so the backlash wasn't as severe as he'd expected. CHADY, having suffered the brunt of the attack, limped towards Jeong, bringing with her more down bad bullshit. She glazed Jeong for being strong, confessing that he was way stronger than she thought he was. However, inasmuch as she was drenched by his strength, she couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room. Was it just her, or was that beetle bastard attempting to get back up? Surely she had to be seeing things, right? Nope, she wasn't. The beetle bastard was indeed trying to get back up. In fact, she wasn't the only one who noticed this peculiarity. Dwayne and Kim, who were on the opposite side, noticed this as well. With strained faces, the duo watched the pest, dreading what it had in store for them. Would it regenerate? Or possibly something more absurd, like a second form? They couldn't tell, but they were sure some shit was cooking. This was L.A.G after all. Kim, having had enough of this bullshit, said fuck that and jetted forward. Although it was customary for bots to watch the boss power up before attacking, he said hell no to that bullshit and sprang forward. Why would he foolishly let it power up when he could end it right then and there? Thus, with the aid of his trusty soul hammer, he lunged in, smashing the absolute shit out of the beetle and all relevant plot tropes. Unbelievably, the strike actually landed and put an end to the beetle. I'd initially thought the bastard was dead, being as he was raising some serious death flags, but to my surprise, he actually survived, with his conquest of victory clear for all to see. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, watched the homie silently, refusing to comment on Not's unusual optimism. He had more experience in L.A.G, so how could he possibly be swayed so easily? If Kim was really safe and not raising more death flags for himself, then he should probably get the hell out of that corpse instead of standing there like an idiot. But hey, what did he know? It wasn't like he was a regressor who'd survived countless regressions in L.A.G. Speaking of the corpse, he could have sworn his danger detection activated when he landed the last strike. If his suspicion was correct, then there had to be something else going on. However, he wasn't certain, so there was no point in jinxing their asses. Who knows? Maybe the unusually optimistic Not would be right this time, and the trial would end without incident. And even if it didn't, it wasn't his ass on the line, so why should he care? Kim, completely oblivious to Jeong's jinxing thoughts, swaggered from the corpse, an obvious spring in his steps. He told the squad the beetle was easy money, so it wasn't surprising that it fell to the mighty him. However, inasmuch as he was mighty, and bringing the beetle down was child's play to the CHADY him, they shouldn't shortchange him and should give the appropriate compensation during the soul split. He did land the finishing blow after all. Just as he was about to glaze himself some more, a head suddenly sprang from above, blitzing the absolute shit out of him. It chomped his body, seemingly saying, "Got you," to his hopeful, red-flagging ass. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, sighed softly, obviously having expected this. Where did Not and Kim think this was? Nanya? Nah, it wasn't that childish bullshit. This was L.A.G. The only magic in this hell was death and the spectacle of cheeks being clapped. However, he would be lying if he said he wasn't hopeful this time. Had things ended nicely, it would have been great. But alas, this was L.A.G, and such fantasies never exist in this hell. Turning back to the pest, he could finally see it in all its glory. It was a giant centipede-like creature, albeit more ferocious and deadly. CHADY took in the sight and trembled slightly. Were they supposed to fight that thing? No. Before that, where did it even come from? Surely it couldn't have been hiding inside the beetle, right? Jeong glanced at her but didn't reply. If she couldn't figure that much out on her own, then she was useless, and there was no point in answering her question. However, she did have a right to be scared, because shit was about to go down. True to this thought, the centipede lunged at them, moving with such speed that the duo barely survived. They clumsily dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding a quick kiss with death. CHADY, having seen an opening, quickly slashed at the pest, leaving a nasty wound on its flank. The wound bled like crazy, sputtering putrid blood across the entire floor. Unfortunately, blood wasn't the only thing sputtering from the wound. Alongside it was a swarm of maggots, which didn't hesitate to bite into CHADY's hand. The baddie noticed this and immediately backpedaled, urgently calling out to Jeong to warn him. She told him about the maggots and how absurdly painful it was to be bitten by them. Jeong, clearly alarmed by this, quickly backpedaled, obviously wanting no part in that smoke. He then stared at the centipede, instinctively realizing it wouldn't be so simple to take it down. Sure, its skin was soft, and his blade could probably cut through it like tofu. However, the presence of the maggots was a big issue, one he had to figure out before making any decisive moves. CHADY, choosing to support her boo, asked what they should do next. They couldn't keep standing there, after all. Jeong replied that it was simple. They just had to stop the centipede's monstrous speed and movements. As for how they'd do that, she shouldn't worry. They weren't the only reliable ones in the squad. As if on cue, Dwayne joined the fray, landing a devastating kick on the centipede. He savagely pinned it to the ground, effectively thwarting any attempts to move by the pest. As for Jeong, he was already on the move, an aura of majesty radiating from him. This aura was the manifestation of the fifth door, a buff that raised his strength to the transcendental level. Thanks to the buff, his body brimmed with strength, allowing him to stab deep into the centipede. He then proceeded to slash across its flank, leaving a devastating wound in his wake. Jeong skidded to a stop before shifting his gaze to the centipede. He'd known the fifth door would be mighty, but damn, he hadn't thought it would be this broken. Not only had it allowed him to slash the centipede in two, it also gave him absurd speed, enabling him to do so within a second. Without a doubt, the skill was broken, and he couldn't wait to explore just how incredible it was at the higher levels. Locking back in, the squad collectively focused on the centipede. Although they knew it was dying, they couldn't risk it. Such negligence often led to death, after all. Luckily, nothing popped off, and the only thing they had to worry about was the maggots in the blood. Dwayne took point and roared at them, effectively annihilating any maggot that came his way. Jeong, however, was flashy with it, erecting a lightning shield to protect both himself and the baddie. As for CHADY, she had a blush on her face, obviously drenched by Jeong's alleged concern for her. When everything settled down, the trio finally relaxed, happy that things ended without incident. However, since this was still L.A.G, they had to be sure. So Jeong kicked the corpse a couple of times. Fortunately, there was no reaction, meaning they were safe for the time being. But then again, the key word was time being, since their horror in the trial was far from over. To the side was another menace, one I'm sure most of you had forgotten about. But obviously it didn't care about that, since it continued to clap cheeks as intended. It cleaved through them with ease, making me wonder how we'd forgotten about it in the first place. But hey, we're here now, so we might as well enjoy the cheeks filet mignon. Just as the giant mantis was enjoying its buffet of cheeks, a silhouette suddenly spawned from the side, clocking the absolute shit out of it. He then unleashed a flurry of punches, leaving the pest dazed for a second. However, that second swiftly passed, and the mantis retaliated with the quickness. It slashed at the fool, giving him no time to counter. Luckily, the slash was off target, so the fool managed to keep his pathetic life. On second thought, scratch that. Turns out it wasn't luck at all, rather the intervention of the CHADY. The unit had smashed into the mantis, forcing its strike to veer off course. The mantis, in return, retaliated immediately, sending him flying like a ragdoll. Just as it was about to press the attack, its antennae twitched like crazy, warning it of an impending attack. Unfortunately, the warning came too late, as our boy was already on the prowl. He lunged in like a lightning god, kicking the shit out of the mantis. The mantis was dazed for a second, but ultimately didn't suffer any damage. Jeong saw this, and his eyes twitched. To think they'd been struggling with a beetle when such a monster was in the room. They sure were lucky, because those two teaming up would have been a disaster. CHADY, seemingly coming to the same conclusion, drew her sword, her intent to battle evident. She asked Jeong what they'd do. The mantis looked hella sturdy after all. Jeong replied that he wasn't sure, but the best bet was to probe it for its weaknesses. If they could determine those, then their chances of victory would increase significantly. To that effect, he promptly issued his orders. The new guy was to attack from the left, Dwayne from the right, and he himself would handle the front. If they flanked it from all sides, then there was a chance they might actually succeed. CHADY, clearly having missed her name, asked about herself. What would she do? Jeong replied that she was useless, so she might as well support them from the rear. However, if she sees an opportunity, she should feel free to take it. With that, the trio prepared for battle, lunging into the fray soon after. The mantis responded in kind, shrieking to welcome their onslaught. Why wouldn't it, when they were practically gifting it more cheeks to clap? Without a doubt, this was going to be fun, and it couldn't wait to enjoy more cheeks filet mignon. Surprisingly, the first one to attack was the new guy, who made it to the target before Jeong and Dwayne. He nimbly dodged the mantis's blades, weaving between the slashes like a swift blade. Dwayne, on the other hand, tanked the blows, resorting to brute strength to weather the attacks. He, of course, dodged those that he couldn't. He wasn't courting his own death, after all. As for Jeong, he had it the easiest, with his electric slashes going toe-to-toe with the mantis. However, despite their tag team, the mantis was still formidable, so it managed to fend off their attacks. The trio collectively noticed this and backed off with the quickness. They each assessed the mantis, debating over suitable strategies to bring it down. Jeong, in particular, took it seriously, knowing any slight negligence could lead to their deaths. He brainstormed ideas before finally settling on attacking the front legs. Although the legs were the most formidable and their toughness couldn't be scoffed at, he still had enough confidence to give it a try. Thus, he promptly lunged back in, hoping his trusty bone blade wouldn't let him down. As he ran, Jeong didn't forget to call upon the squad. He instructed them to aim for the legs, hinting that he'd do his best to draw the mantis's attention. However, whether it would work or not was uncertain, so the duo best take care of themselves. Having said that, Jeong shot at the target, narrowly avoiding a slash in the process. He deftly dodged to the side, easily avoiding a follow-up swing by the mantis. Unfortunately, that was the most he could do, as the next attack left him with no openings. His only option was to risk it lest he be sliced in twain by the scythes. Jeong didn't hesitate and immediately jumped upwards. Although doing so would put him in the mantis's crosshairs, he had no choice but to gamble on it. Besides, it wasn't like he was completely helpless. He still had his lightning steps to rely on. Thus, he swiftly shot forward, escaping the mantis's danger zone with the quickness. When he did, he found himself before the mantis's head. Jeong didn't hesitate and swung at it, leaving a nasty wound on its eye. He then parkoured off its face, making sure to avoid any follow-up attacks. Just like that, the homie was safe, and he even blitzed the mantis to show off his kahunas. Too bad he didn't have more time, otherwise he would have definitely blitzed the other eye as well. Dwayne, seeing that Jeong was safe, lunged into the fray, teaming up with the new guy to yeet the oblivious mantis. They successfully broke its leg, forcing the mantis to wobble like cheeks on a thick mommy. Luckily, the risk wasn't for naught, and the mantis was quickly brought to its knees. The trio, seeing this, didn't waste any time and immediately pressed the attack. They knew this was their best chance, so wasting it was never an option. They each lunged forward, releasing their own attacks on the mantis. Regrettably, the mantis was still formidable, so most of their attacks amounted to nothing. Jeong, who was taking the lead on the attack, furrowed his brows, an obvious frown on his face. He'd already known the mantis was mighty. But damn, wasn't this a bit too much? Not only was it keeping up with their speed while injured, it could also track their attacks, enabling it to block them with ease. Not only that, the pest was fearless, completely unfazed by the concept of pain. Without a doubt, the battle would be grueling, even more so than they'd initially anticipated. Locking back in, Jeong immediately noticed a peculiar detail. The mantis's leg was glowing, almost as if it was gathering energy. This gave him a bad feeling, making his hair stand on end. However, now wasn't the time for that shit, so he quickly dialed in. He promptly called to the duo, warning them of the impending attack. Regrettably, the warning came too late, since the mantis was already on the move. It slashed at the newbie, sending a wind blade at him. The latter was too slow to react, resulting in a head-on cleave. The newbie, who was at first confused by the development, suddenly showed a spooked face, a feeling of wrongness welling up in his heart. He wondered why his thoughts were sluggish, and why the ground was suddenly moving towards him. Unbeknownst to him, he was already dead. He just hadn't realized it yet. To make matters worse, it was a gruesome death, with his cheeks split in half. Damn. Dwayne, who was watching from the sidelines, jumped back in shock, puzzled by what just happened. Jeong clarified that it was a sneak attack, a last resort by the mantis. It had coated its legs with some kind of energy, allowing for long-ranged attacks. And although he wasn't sure what it was exactly, he still cautioned Dwayne to be careful because it seemed like trouble. Dwayne said bet, and locked all the fuck in. He would have loved to charge in, but quickly held himself back in fear of the mantis's many tricks. As for the mantis, it went all out, sending a flurry of slashes at the boys. The duo noticed this, and promptly prepared for the attack. Dwayne braced for impact, while Jeong moved to evade. However, halfway through his escape, he suddenly stopped and yelled at Dwayne to stop fucking around. That wasn't something he could block, so he best get his ass out of the way. Dwayne didn't argue and swiftly jumped to the side. He was glad he did, because the wind blade was indeed formidable. If he'd stubbornly tanked that, then he might as well have ended up like the newbie. Jeong, having survived the flurry of attacks, turned his focus to the mantis, an obvious frown on his face. He was livid to discover that the mantis had played them for fools, managing to rise to its feet while they weren't watching. Without a doubt, this was a bad thing, especially with how much effort they needed to knock it back down. Just as he was contemplating his next steps, a silhouette suddenly flashed past him, heading straight for the mantis. The silhouette was obviously CHADY, who'd finally joined the fray. Jeong, however, wasn't happy about this and promptly told her to retreat. Didn't she hear what he said? She was useless, so what the hell was she doing? CHADY, clearly unfazed by the taunt, ignored his warning and continued her charge toward the mantis. She told Jeong she knew what she was doing, so he shouldn't stress too much. Besides, if she left them to handle everything and they ended up dying, wouldn't she be shooting herself in the foot? No matter what, she had to help, so Jeong should cool his titties. Speaking of cool, she had just the right skill for the job. It was the mist breath, which effectively created a frost smokescreen. Although the skill wasn't overpowered, it still had its uses, especially when used strategically. And lo and behold, now was a strategic moment, so the Chads better move their asses. The duo said bet and immediately joined the fray. They knew this was their last chance, so they dared not be careless. If they couldn't bring the blind mantis down, then things would only get worse for them. Unfortunately, the mantis wasn't just going to wait for its death. It furiously retaliated, unleashing a flurry of slashes at the boys. The slashes were deadlier than the last, because all of them were random. Since the mantis couldn't see them, it opted for a random barrage, hoping to wound them in the chaos. Jeong, feeling the intensity of the attack, cursed his luck and cursed the mantis for going so far. If he'd known blinding it would make it this crazy, he would have definitely stopped CHADY. But even so, he could still manage. So he hoped Dwayne would be alright as well. Speaking of Dwayne, he'd grown tired of running and decided to make his stand instead. He bravely faced off against a wind blade, clearly not intending to evade. Jeong, seeing this, shouted at him to be careful. Now wasn't the time for that macho bullshit. If he wanted to test his bravado, then he should do it at his own time instead of doing so in the middle of a fight. Obviously, Dwayne didn't listen and stood steadfast in his decision. He simply unleashed his stored potential, calling upon his trump card. Ultimate form, Beastification. The skill activated, kicking up a windstorm. Dwayne's appearance also changed, taking on a more beastly form. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, couldn't hide the shock on his face. He'd expected Dwayne to be up to something. But what the hell was that? What was he even looking at right now? Was he a Wolverine? Nah, he couldn't be. There was no way he could outshine him by channeling the power of the Poppy Logan. In any case, things were about to get interesting, and they might very well get a chance to try out some mantis cheek steaks. The juicy ones, of course. Dwayne, fully consumed by the power of the beast, ignored Jeong's shock and locked in on the incoming wind blade. He let loose a guttural roar, easily blocking the once formidable blade. Without hesitation, he pressed the attack, rapidly closing in on the dazed mantis. Jeong, who was watching from the sidelines, had his mouth wide agape, shocked by Dwayne's sudden prowess. He'd always known Dwayne was formidable, but holy fuck, he didn't know he had it like that. Not only was he supremely powerful, but he also had the aura of a Poppy, completely capable of rivaling him in the I'm him department. Without a doubt, Dwayne was thou, and he couldn't wait to see some cakes being baked. Dwayne, completely oblivious to Jeong's wild glazing, approached the mantis, his indomitable spirit on full display. He easily clawed through the mantis's follow-up attack, leaving it open for a counterattack. The mantis, however, didn't back down and swiftly engaged him in a desperate melee. The duo went toe-to-toe, with neither side conceding. Jeong, noticing this, stopped being a bystander and quickly joined the fray. He knew such tremendous power always had a downside, so Dwayne would probably need his help. Besides, he was the MC, so how could he possibly let Dwayne show him up? He had to get in there, otherwise he might really lose his CHADY Poppy certificate. Dwayne, once again oblivious to Jeong's wild thoughts, continued his tango, his relentless charge not slowing even a little. He knew his power-up was limited, so he resolved to make the best out of it. Mastering his will, he lunged at the mantis, an aura of destined doom enveloping him. The mantis, in return, swung at him, unleashing a flurry of wind blades. They were all aimed at Dwayne's vitals, not giving the former a chance to block. Dwayne, however, wasn't flustered and bravely faced them head-on. He first tore through the wind blades before parrying the mantis's front legs. Leveraging this opening, he gathered his energy before shooting straight for the mantis. Although his condition wasn't perfect, he still had enough in the tank to make a big move. Thus, he resolutely shot forward, his Hadoken at the ready. Channeling his Street Fighter, he blitzed past the mantis, tearing a huge chunk from its head. The blow left it reeling, causing it to shriek out in pain. Dwayne, however, didn't care about that, and swiftly prepared a run-it-back no jutsu. He promptly charged through the dust, shooting straight for the mantis. During his flight, he grit his teeth, hoping the buff would last him through the fight. However, this was L.A.G, and such foolish hopes could never prevail. Just as he was about to land the finishing blow, the buff suddenly ended, leaving Dwayne in a perilous situation. He essentially became a sitting duck, one willingly sending itself to its demise. Fortunately, Dwayne wasn't alone, and Jeong promptly stepped in to help. He manifested a dazzling bone lance, which he didn't hesitate to yeet at the mantis. The lance tore through the air, clocking the pest in the face. This gave Dwayne an opening, which he swiftly used to backpedal. He then urgently fled the battlefield, leaving the rest to Jeong. As if sensing Dwayne's will, Jeong locked the fuck in and shot straight for the mantis. He didn't waste time and immediately pulled out the big guns, cheeks clapping no jutsu, forbidden technique, fifth gate unlocked. Buffed by the power of Thor, he immediately commenced his counterattack, zapping the shit out of the mantis. The shock was so intense that the mantis's head exploded, sending a rain of blood and flesh pouring down. Jeong noticed this and swiftly retreated. He really wanted no part in that smoke. He gracefully landed a distance away, completely unbothered by the humongous pest he'd just slain. However, after a moment of hesitation, he regrouped with the squad, an obvious look of vigilance on his face. Since the last boss had a second form, wasn't it possible that this one had one as well? He keenly studied the corpse, waiting for any shit to pop off. Luckily, nothing happened, and the pest was dead for real. This greatly delighted the squad, who collectively heaved a sigh of relief. They confidently walked forward, eager to collect the loot. And judging by the color of the soul, it was clear they'd made a fortune this time. Jeong smiled at the reward before shifting his gaze to the right. That was the location of the exit door, which had appeared after the mantis was slain. He visibly hesitated for a while before deciding against being rash. Since the whole party was tired and the door wasn't going anywhere, it was probably wiser to stay there and recuperate. Thus, he immediately gave the order, instructing the duo to rest. Dwayne and Kara didn't object, because they indeed needed the rest. They promptly settled to recuperate, only rising after they were completely healed. After checking their gear, the group swaggered to the exit, eager to leave that cursed room. This was particularly true for CHADY, who seemed to be panting in relief. Wait, hold up. Something doesn't seem right. It's either this maiden is horny as usual, or something else is cooking in the background. In any case, we'll find out later, so there's no point in speculating. After walking for a while, the group finally reached their destination. It was the same room with multiple doors where they could pick their next trial. Jeong took the initiative and drew the duo's attention to the 8th door. Unlike the rest of the 7 doors, it didn't have a label, meaning it wasn't part of the trial. However, judging by the fact that it needed a key to open, he guessed it was probably like the last vendor room where he had to use the maze key to enter. Dwayne agreed with him, saying he was probably right. But even so, they had to be careful. This was L.A.G after all. Jeong acknowledged the warning before shifting his focus to CHADY. The maiden seemed off, so he asked if she was okay. CHADY replied that she was fine, just a little bit nauseous. She told the Chads not to worry about her. She'd be fine after a little rest. She wanted to reassure them some more, but her face suddenly changed. To the duo's shock, she suddenly started coughing, causing them to stare at her worriedly. Regrettably, that was just the beginning, as she soon descended into a wheezing and coughing fit. She coughed her lungs out, even vomiting a mouthful of blood. CHADY noticed this, and her face changed drastically. She zeroed in on the blood, and her face paled even more. Turns out blood wasn't the only thing she was coughing up. There were also maggots, meaning the previous contact wasn't as simple as they thought. Shit. Dwayne picked up on this as well and approached the baddie. He intended to ask if she was okay, but the blood coughing made that irrelevant. CHADY, on the other hand, ignored his concern, her focus entirely on the blood. She wondered what was wrong and why maggots were mixed in with her blood. Clearly panicked, she turned to Jeong, hoping the chatty poppy would have a solution for her. However, before she could even raise the topic, her body suddenly spasmed, causing her to cough up more blood. Frantic and in pain, she collapsed to the floor, a flood of blood pooling beneath her. Jeong, finally snapping from his daze, ran to the maiden, an unconcealed worry in his voice. He urged Dwayne to help him. They'd try their best to save her. Unfortunately, they were also clueless about what was happening, so the best they could do was lay her down. Feeling her life drain from her body, CHADY stuttered a plea, begging the Chads to save her. This request put more pressure on the Chads, who had no idea how to respond. Dwayne suggested using a healing potion on her, but Jeong quickly shot down that suggestion. It wasn't that he didn't care. Rather, CHADY's current condition made it impossible to swallow the cure. And even if she did, with how pathetic her state was, there was a fat chance the potion would help at all. CHADY, hearing him shoot down her last hope of survival, pleaded with him, begging that she didn't want to die. She repeatedly mumbled this request, ignoring her already deteriorating condition. Moved by her insistent pleas, Jeong tried to think of a solution, but all he came up with were blanks. He had no idea what he was dealing with, and his best bet was that maggots were in her body. However, if that was the case, what could he possibly do, especially when the maggots seemed to have infested her whole body? He thought about it some more, but CHADY's clearly deteriorating condition gave him no room to breathe. Just as he was about to console the baddie, her stomach suddenly wriggled, scaring the shit out of them. The duo decisively jumped back, a look of horror evident on their faces. They wondered what was going on, but that question was soon answered by a bloody rapture from CHADY's belly. A creature suddenly emerged, accompanied by gore and maggots. It then lunged at Dwayne, not giving the latter a chance to react. Jeong, seeing this, quickly countered, zapping the shit out of the creature. He unleashed his fury upon the fiend, only stopping after it was a burnt char on the ground. After his successful conquest, he turned to Dwayne, asking the Chad if he was all right. Dwayne replied that he was, but that wasn't what was important right now. Wasn't this creature the same centipede that came out of the beetle? If so, then what was it doing in CHADY's body? He could have sworn Jeong would be the first in her body, but who could have guessed he'd be beat by a centipede? Jeong ignored Not's foolish banter and thought back to the past. He quickly remembered the incident with the maggots, which gave him a vague idea of when CHADY was infested. However, even if he knew that, what good could it possibly do now? The baddie was already dead, and there was nothing he could do about it. Enraged and regretful, he stomped on the centipede, venting a bit of his anger. He also did this as a precaution, since the centipede was more insidious than he'd thought. Not only did it infest by the slightest contact with its maggots, it also spread rapidly, guaranteeing certain death upon infestation. Not to mention it also consumed you from the inside out, making it one of the worst ways to die in L.A.G. Without a doubt, he had to be careful lest they get infested by any surviving maggots. Done with this task, Jeong turned to CHADY, and his hatred for the author deepened significantly. He'd always known the homie was a hater. But goddamn, did he have to do her like that? If he had to go this far to keep him maidenless, then he might as well be without hose. Nevertheless, this was indeed a shame, and he hoped the maiden would find peace at least. He called out to Dwayne, telling the latter it was time to bounce. He did so decisively, even daring not to collect her soul. Dwayne said, "Bet," and quickly followed suit. He asked Jeong where they'd go, but Jeong told him anywhere was better than there. Thus, he wisely stayed quiet, following Jeong into the 8th door. The door was predictably a bonus room, coupled with the obvious vendor and recovery rooms. Of course, the doorway to the main trial still existed, so the Chads could choose that option as well. Jeong didn't waste time and headed for recovery. Although his condition wasn't bad, it was still wiser to heal when he could. Besides, his mind was in chaos right now, and he really needed a place to quietly think. Dwayne seemed to pick up on this as well, and worriedly asked if he was okay. Jeong replied that he was, but it was clear he was not. CHADY's death had hit him hard, and he was obviously struggling with that fact. Dwayne knew this as well, so he brought up CHADY's soul. If he was really okay, as he'd said, then why didn't he collect it? Jeong replied that he didn't see the need to, since they were comrades and all. It was CHADY's fortune that he didn't collect it, so Dwayne shouldn't worry about it. On that note, why was he so concerned about the dead? If he had that much energy to waste, then he should use it to get off his back. Dwayne chose to stay quiet, but deep down, he knew what was up. CHADY's death had affected Jeong. It's just that he was being a tsundere about it. In any case, he decided to let him be. He couldn't force him to express his feelings after all. Zeroing in on Jeong, Dwayne watched worriedly as he settled into the recovery pod. He knew the consequences of this loss would be dire, but that was something his future self would handle. He sighed heartily, choosing to ignore it for now. However, before he could settle in the pod, loud voices sounded from outside, causing his expression to change. The voices were quickly revealed to be other players, a fact that greatly unsettled Dwayne. The players also noticed this, and they quickly expressed their killing intent. They deemed Dwayne an easy target, given that they had the numbers advantage. Dwayne, on the other hand, didn't hesitate and charged at them. When clearly in a disadvantageous position, it was always wiser to take the initiative. Besides, the recovery room was too small for battle, so he had to take the fight outside. He charged for the troublesome trio, clashing with them soon after. Jeong, currently in the healing pod, watched this happen, and his face turned ugly as well. He wanted nothing more than to burst out of there, but regrettably he couldn't. The recovery pods were controlled by L.A.G, so a forceful exit was impossible. The second you settled in the pod, you couldn't leave until the healing was done. In other words, he was trapped, and he couldn't help Dwayne until his 10-minute recovery was completed. Fuck. Speaking of Dwayne, he had one bastard pinned, though he wasn't happy about it at all. He'd hoped his attack would handle 3 at least, but of course that didn't work out. Because of that, it was now 1 against 4. A clear disadvantage, to say the least. The squad, however, was having fun, completely unbothered by their fallen comrade. They even smoked the poor Chad, saying he was useless to begin with. Damn. Dwayne, seeing this, locked in, a grave expression on his face. If the squad was that ruthless to one of their own, he could only imagine what they'd do to him. He had to hold on, no matter what, at least until Jeong could join the fight. Having settled on this, he didn't waste time and immediately lunged at the foes. The bastards responded in kind, shooting for him as well. Thus, a deadly melee ensued, all under the leader's watch. He deliberately stayed back to watch, waiting for an opportunity to sneak attack. Despite knowing this, Dwayne still lunged, meeting the trio in a desperate dance. What choice did he have? It wasn't like he had a better option after all. Luckily, he was still him, so he quickly dispatched another player. That brought the enemy count to 3, giving him a better chance at survival. What stressed Dwayne was that the leader didn't seem to be panicking at all. He coolly took his subordinate's death in stride, clearly unbothered by it. Not only that, he nonchalantly gave new orders, instructing the squad to trap Dwayne instead. Since the Chad was that formidable, it only made sense that they'd trap him first. The squad swiftly complied and bound Dwayne. They used a player's unique skill, rendering any attempts to break free futile. Realizing he was truly trapped, Dwayne couldn't help but curse. He couldn't even use his beastification to break free because his body was still trashed. Without a doubt, he was cooked, and he couldn't see himself getting out of this. The squad, however, wasn't faring great either. One member had been killed on the spot, and another had a broken arm to cry about. He tried to complain to the leader, but the ruthless bastard told him to shut up. Their comrade had died, so the least he could do was bear with it. Besides, there was a recovery room, so why was he making a fuss? The second bastard said bet and turned to Dwayne. Since it was this fucker who injured him, it was only right that he got his lick back. Not to mention he was tied up, so he couldn't even resist. He told Dwayne to prepare himself, because he was about to stick him deep. Pause. As if that wasn't sus enough, the third-rate villain proceeded to give a little bit of pause-worthy lore about his sword. He told Dwayne he'd bought the gem from a vendor, and its effects were indeed interesting. Would Dwayne care to guess what its effects were? He should definitely give it a try because it might just surprise him. However, if he's too eager to find out, then he'll give him a hint. It has something to do with pain, or rather, pleasure in his case. Dwayne realized the dangerous shift in the topic and immediately spoke up to stop him. He had no interest in opening that mystery door, and he told the bastard the same. Heck, this wasn't even a case of curiosity killed the cat anymore. He might just fuck around and find out. Literally. Noticing the caution in Dwayne's tone, the budget villain chuckled in amusement. He told Dwayne not to worry, he won't poke him just yet. However, getting to know the effects of the sword was a given, especially since he wanted to have fun with him. Dwayne shouldn't worry because the effect might just be to his liking as well. Well, assuming he's a naughty dog just like him. The sword basically triples the pain, making it a superb tool. If Dwayne is down for the uglies, aka masochism, he'll definitely enjoy the show. If not, well, let's just say Mount Tai won't be the only thing standing straight today. Dwayne heard the bastard's ramblings and immediately looked at him weirdly. What the hell was this fool on about? And since when did L.A.G have such down bad units? If he didn't know any better, he might have thought it was not talking. But alas, it's just the author being horny again. Someone should probably get some water for his thirsty ass. Locking back in, the budget villain continued his bullshit ramblings. He told Dwayne all tough men break, so he didn't mind his pitiful resistance. After poking him a few times, he was sure he'd show the face he most desired to see. Pause. Dwayne said fuck that, and locked in. If he continued to let this bastard wild on, he might just get himself into a sticky situation. Literally. Thus, the best way out of this was a preemptive attack. He quickly roared at him, catching the horny fool off guard. Regrettably, the attack was swiftly intercepted, so he didn't manage to finish off the loathsome fool. Realizing the minion was getting sidetracked, his comrades told him to stop messing around. Even if he wanted some naughty action, he shouldn't lower his guard so foolishly. The boss also emphasized this, warning him to keep his horny head on a swivel. As for himself, he'd keep his eye on Dwayne, because this unit wasn't one to be trifled with. The minion said bet and locked in. Since Dwayne was refusing his generous loving, he might as well be harsh about it. He immediately stabbed his neck, ensuring the sword poked deep enough to cause major pain. However, he was also very careful so Dwayne wouldn't die from just that. Following this trend, he proceeded to stab the unit, aiming for the painful, yet non-fatal points. He did so with uttermost precision, making sure Dwayne felt the pain and lived on to regret it. The leader, finally fed up with the spectacle, told him to stop messing around and end it. He neither had the time nor desire, to stick around and watch his bullshit. The minion reluctantly agreed and prepared to slash. He would have loved to play with Dwayne further, but alas, orders were orders. He immediately stabbed at Dwayne, ready to give him the last poking of his life. Pause. Goddamn. Just as the blade was about to end our boy, a gentle voice drifted in, shocked to see Dwayne there. The mysterious voice didn't waste time and immediately clocked a fool. She torched his binding ass, making sure his ugly mag was nice and crispy. The leader, realizing things had taken an unexpected turn, dropped his facade, showing a panicked look for once. He immediately signaled to his last minion, hinting at him to make a move. However, both the bastard and myself were too distracted to take a step. The minion was probably thinking about the sudden interruption, whereas the poppy knot was focused on the burst. Was it just him, or was this cake of deliciousness clearly familiar? Nah, it wasn't just him because the cake was definitely someone we know, the baddie Kara. Dwayne, clearly thrilled as well, palmed the minion, yeeting his head into the floor. He then stomped his arm, ensuring he didn't try some sneaky shit. Satisfied with the bastard's screams, he cocked his hand back, ready to unleash his ultimate wrath. He let him have it, burying his head into the ground. With his death, the leader panicked and immediately stepped up to fight. He charged at Kara, hoping to eliminate the variable first. Kara, however, didn't panic and calmly looked at him. She even shot him a sympathetic smile, seemingly pitying his fate. The leader picked up on this and suddenly had a bad feeling. His expression drastically changed, making the oh shit face. Jeong, who'd at some point sneaked up on the fool, breathed down his neck, giving him the full Diddy treatment. He ignored the boss's panicked toot and zapped the shit out of him. After this satisfying revenge, he turned just in time to catch the maiden in his arms. Turns out Kara was also in the drought, and she didn't hesitate to jump on our boy. Dwayne, however, watched the two lovebirds and his stomach churned with jealousy. He didn't want to be an asshole, but come on. Can't they save him first? Jeong, seemingly realizing his oversight, stopped fondling cheeks and immediately ran to his aid. He promptly carried him to the recovery room, saving Dwayne in time. After a session of healing, the wounds were finally gone, and the trio could truly reunite in earnest. They quickly embraced each other, delighted that they were still alive. Kara in particular was genuinely happy that she'd reunited with her boo. She didn't say much, but it was clear her time apart was hell. However, she became stronger as a result, so she wasn't bothered by it. Noticing the elephant in the room, Jeong stepped forward to address it. What was up with the eye patch, and was she a pirate or something? Kara replied that it was an old wound, but also much more. She won't give him the exact details, but he'll find out eventually. Jeong agreed and instantly dropped the issue. Since his boo wanted to surprise him, he'd let her have her fun. Who knows? Maybe the secret might just be the plot armor they need to save their asses in the future. Done with the reunion, they each took turns to visit the vendor. When it was Jeong's turn, he immediately let it splash with some purchases. He bought 3 skills, 2 regular and 1 spicy. The regular can be ignored, so let's focus on the spicy. The skill, as you can see, is called Overflowing Blood. It doubles the amount of blood, so I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. If you don't, just know it involves the CHADY scriptures, more specifically the 2nd chapter. Thou clappeth thy cheeks. Anyway, he bought everything he wanted and swiftly returned to the lobby. While there, the trio discussed for a while before letting Jeong choose the next room. He was the leader anyway, so that much was expected. Jeong didn't hesitate and chose B715. Although he didn't know what was waiting for them, he still had immense confidence in his squad. Besides, the maiden Kara was back, so he was looking forward to some eye candy. Who knows? Maybe things would be different this time, and her cheeks would finally be consistent. Fingers crossed. With that hope in his heart, Jeong and the squad entered the next room. What greeted them was a hallway drenched in blood, too eerie and bizarre to describe. The trio immediately went on high alert, especially Kara, who gave off an odd vibe. She didn't say much, but it was clear she held more secret cards than she'd let on. Feeling the atmosphere grow more tense, Jeong gave the order to proceed. Although he also had a bad feeling about the room, his ample experience told him staying still would be courting death. In such situations, it was common sense to leave a hallway drenched in blood as soon as possible. Listening to his gut feeling, the trio continued down the hallway for some time. As they did, Kara noticed that the blood-soaked walls weren't the only odd thing about the room. The floors and walls also felt squishy, almost as if they were alive. Dwayne seconded this discovery, saying that the room was off. Hadn't they noticed that things were too quiet? Ever since they entered the room, it felt like someone was watching them and would jump on them at any time, yet nothing of the sort happened. It was too quiet to be normal. Jeong heard their doubts, but kept quiet. He continued to lead the squad up until they reached a fork in the road. Just as they were discussing which path to take, a scream of pain and anguish bellowed from in front, scaring the shit out of them. Dwayne looked at the others and said hell no. He knew most of them, especially Kara and her white ass, would probably be tempted to investigate that. However, he'd like to tell her in no uncertain terms that he wouldn't investigate that shit. If she felt her snow bunny genes compelling her to court death, then she should leave him out of it. Jeong, clearly the master of smoke, told Dwayne to pipe down and follow along. What better place than the bosom of danger would they find the best rewards? He voted to check out the site of the scream, and he knew Kara Snow Bunny Levine would agree. However, contrary to both of their claims, Kara was actually opposed to the idea. First of all, she told Dwayne not to play with her. Her food was seasoned as fuck. Second of all, although she hailed from the mountains of Caucasus, she wasn't keen on investigating strange phenomena like those basic bitches in the movies. She'd rather avoid that shit if she could help it. Dwayne looked at her incredulously. Why was she choosing to avoid the smoke this time? Could it be that her snowflake genes were on reboot? Kara replied that her genes were okay. She just didn't want that smoke. They could call it a hunch, but she really didn't want to go towards that scream. Jeong thought about it and said, okay. This ready compliance shocked Dwayne, who'd always known Jeong to be about that heat. He wondered what was wrong and why nobody was behaving as usual. Jeong replied that he indeed liked smoke, but that was always for a reason. Danger and rewards go hand in hand, so he mostly followed that trend to help them survive longer. Dwayne might not know this, but the best way to survive in L.A.G was to dive headfirst into as many dangerous situations as he could. Only then would he get the souls necessary to survive longer. Dwayne said bet, but then looked at him incredulously. If what he said was true, then why was he avoiding danger this time? Jeong replied that he lived for smoke, but he also lived for his squad. If Kara said she had a bad feeling, then he'd take a step back for his maiden. Who knows, maybe his loyalty would be appreciated, and he'd harvest some cheeks in the future. It damn sure beats risking his life for uncertain gains. The trio chuckled at his antics before proceeding forward. They chose the left fork, the one leading away from the ominous sound. However, after walking for a while, the same scream bellowed, almost as if it was following them. It also came from up ahead, meaning their efforts to avoid it were for naught. This discovery spooked the trio, who couldn't help but wonder what was up. Could it be that the scream, and whatever caused it, would always follow them no matter what path they took? If so, then what was the point of giving them a fork to choose from in the first place? Jeong sighed at the fact before walking forward. Since they'd already established escape was impossible, it was better to just go with it. He led the group down the ominous hall, clearly eager to meet the source of the scream as soon as possible. Kara, however, subtly trailed back, her demeanor more puzzling than ever. She silently activated her skill, doing her best to keep it hidden from the Chads. Just as I was beginning to doubt her sketchy ass, she suddenly flicked her head upward, coming face to face with some prying eyes. Turns out she wasn't being stealthy to deceive the boys. Rather, it was to keep her actions hidden from this mysterious being. In fact, she'd always sensed its gaze ever since they entered this room. Not wasting time, she immediately cooked its shit, making sure to give it a full dose of fire blast. She then warned the boys, cautioning them to be wary of the eyes on the wall. Jeong said bet and locked in. If it was before, he wouldn't have noticed, but with Kara's warning, he'd be a fool if he didn't now. He immediately zapped the fool, showing it the consequences of its peeping Tom no jutsu. After his glorious blast, Jeong couldn't help but frown. He knew for a fact his strike didn't land. Otherwise, the Tom would be spasming right now. Matter of fact, Kara's attack didn't land either. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gotten a chance to attack in the first place. Seems like things were more complicated than they'd thought, as the fiend was hell-bent on staying hidden in the wall. Not only that, it could also seamlessly move around, making locking onto it truly difficult. As he was racking his head for a solution, the same scream echoed once again, yanking him from his thoughts. The scream was followed by loud slithering sounds, hinting at an upcoming catastrophe. The squad looked forward, and what they saw scared the shit out of them. They even doubted their own eyes, believing Lag wouldn't go that far. Unfortunately, it was all real, and a nest of snakes was indeed after them. Furthermore, the nest was beyond bizarre, as every snake was headless. The trio noticed this, and their fear intensified tenfold. How else were they to react when faced with such an unexpected threat? They wisely locked in, ready for whatever shit would follow. Kara realized it was her time to shine, stepped up, reassuring the boys to leave it to her. She called upon her magnum opus, blasting a giant fire wheel at the nest. The wheel did major damage, clearing a path through the pit. The trio capitalized on this and followed suit. They made sure to stick to the wheel, leveraging its speed to rush through the hall. However, after a short sprint, Jeong remembered his maiden and the obvious weakness she had. Kara was always weak in stamina, making long-distance sprints her Achilles' heel. She'd soon run out of stamina, so he had to factor that in during their escape. Thus, he called out to Dwayne, telling the latter to match Kara's speed. If he could, he should also be ready to carry her if she lagged behind. Kara heard his concerns and said that. It seems he was still treating her like a damsel. Well, she'd have him know she picked up quite a few tricks during their time apart. She wasn't the same weak damsel, so Jeong shouldn't treat her as such. As if proving her words, she let it fly, zooming way ahead of the boys. In fact, she was so fast, it was undeniable she was the fastest in the squad. Following behind the fire wheel, Kara caught up just as it blasted into a wall. The explosion caused major damage, tearing open an exit. The trio were delighted by this, and consequently ran faster. They each zoomed towards the exit, eager to leave that eerie place. Regrettably, things could never be that easy in Lag. Just as they were closing in on the exit, it started shrinking, blocking their path to freedom. This development spooked the trio, who laid it all on the line to make it out before it did. Jeong, in particular, stopped his frantic sprint and prepared himself for a huge gamble. He instructed the duo to soldier on. He'd buy them as much time as he could. The duo were obviously hesitant, but Jeong's resolute response left no room for argument. They could only sprint forward, praying that Jeong would make it work somehow. Speaking of the Chad, he called upon his Thor-type shit, zapping the hell out of the floor. His reasoning was quite simple. The whole room was alive. He'd always believed the squishy floor, blood-soaked walls, and eyes were more than they let on. If you opened your mind to it, it was entirely possible that the room was alive and they were currently inside it. If you thought about it like that, then it made sense that an electric shock would work on it. And even if it didn't, it was still worth the shot. Luckily, his gamble had played out, and the zap was indeed effective. It successfully slowed the exit's closing, buying enough time for the duo to make it through. Unfortunately, this was still Lag, and the game wouldn't stop just because it was thwarted once. It swiftly came up with another scheme, using the snakes to block the exit instead. Dwayne noticed this and said bet. Since the homie Jeong was putting in the work, it was only fair that he did his part as well. He told Kara to leave this to him. He'd have them out in a flash. He directly activated his beast skill, using his bear claws to tear his way out. The task was grueling, but he had enough in the tank to see it through. Finally, they made it out of the pit, finding themselves in a spacious room. They wanted to celebrate, but they knew it wasn't time for that yet. Not while Jeong was still missing. Where the hell was he? Shit. The duo swiftly stopped their momentum, turned back, and faced the door. They saw Jeong through the closing hole and couldn't help but feel anxious inside. If he couldn't make it through before the opening closed, who knew what shit Lag would pull this time? Thus, they desperately called out to him, urging Jeong to move his ass. When they saw Jeong still not moving, Kara suggested going back for him, but Jeong quickly vetoed the idea. Were they crazy? Why would they willingly dive back into the fray after he'd basically sacrificed himself to save them? Wouldn't his efforts be pointless if they did that? Besides, who told them he needed saving? He was Jeong motherfucking Hyeok. Something this trivial wasn't much to him. He immediately locked in, activating the 5th door from the get-go. Thanks to the tremendous power boost, energy flowed into his being like a flood, kicking up a wave of aura. However, with the wave came intense pressure, and Jeong's body began breaking down as a consequence. He did his best to hold on, but it was clear he couldn't hold it for long. Thus, he swiftly set to action, shooting towards the opening like a crazed beast. The duo on the other side cheered him on, desperately urging him to move his touche. Jeong listened to their voices and moved faster. but it was clear even that much wouldn't be enough to make it in time. The hole seemed to be closing faster, almost as if it was taunting him. Jeong realized this and increased his speed, but his window of escape was shrinking rapidly. He grit his teeth and moved even faster, eventually breaking through the closing entrance. However, that came with obvious consequences, and Jeong nearly lost consciousness after settling down. Luckily, he was still him, so he quickly bitch-slapped the dizziness to the side. Initially delighted that Jeong had made it through, Kara noticed something that made her blood freeze. They weren't the only ones in the room. In the middle of the space was another silhouette, and it had apparently been there the whole time. This realization spooked Kara, especially because they had their guards lowered. If things had played out differently, then both Dwayne and herself would have died without exception. Jeong, clearly oblivious to the duo's rookie mistake, flicked his gaze to the silhouette, a complicated expression on his face. He wondered what gave the entity the confidence to sit so comfortably, but that was quickly answered by a gesture from the latter. Turns out the fiend always had its eyes on them, and nothing they did escaped its notice. In fact, it even had eyes on the back of its head, making it virtually impossible to exploit any blind spots. Realizing this, the trio tensed in panic, but the entity's next actions threw them off. Instead of attacking like all the regular bosses, the entity opted to have a conversation instead. First, it mocked them for being weak, evidenced by the fact that they struggled so much to get there. Their performance was truly subpar, especially when compared to the group that came before them. Second, did they just realize it had been watching them? If so, then they were weaker than it thought. Regardless, they were there now, so it was time to get to work. It slowly rose from its sitting position, turning around to face the group. When it did, they couldn't help but gulp in shock. Were they dreaming? Or did this bastard low-key resemble the devil? They sure hoped not. Otherwise, they'd truly be cooked. Jeong breathed a deep sigh and read the character profile. He really didn't want to, but he had no choice but to accept the facts. This motherfucker was indeed the devil, and he meant that in the literal sense. If this wasn't the definition of cooked, then he had no idea what the fuck was. Locking back in, he watched somberly as the fiend walked up to them. He was tempted to do something about that, but the obvious smirk on the devil's face made him pause. Without a doubt, the fiend was baiting him, and he'd be a fool if he fell for such an obvious plot. Breaking the silence, Kara drew their attention to the bag on the devil's hand. Was it just her? Or did that suspiciously look like human skin? Surely this fiend couldn't have done something so twisted, right? Jeong replied with a tense shrug. Why not? He was the devil after all. If he couldn't make a sack from human skin, who else could? Speaking to this point, Jeong's nerves gradually tightened as he stared at the behemoth before him. He knew this would be a tough fight, and the devil's next words confirmed as much. It calmly gazed at them, welcoming them to have the first strike. Whatever they did or pulled out, it wouldn't interfere with them but honestly face it head-on. Such confidence made Jeong frown, and he couldn't help but reevaluate their chances. If he'd thought they had a 50-50 chance before, he was slowly realizing it was more like 20 to 80, with the 80 being the likelihood of getting their asses clapped. Realizing this, Dwayne stepped up as tribute. If someone had to test the waters, it might as well be him. He swiftly chugged a stamina potion, stepping up to the devil soon after. With that done, he also activated his beastification skill, adding an additional layer to his defense. However, even that didn't reassure him, so he quickly called out to Jeong. He told the homie to look out for him and to quickly intervene if things went south. Matter of fact, that included Kara as well, so the baddie better step in before he got his shit rocked. The duo said bet and watched him go. They promised to step in, especially if he got his shit cooked from the get-go. Dwayne, on the other hand, faced off against the devil. He was low-key having second thoughts, but things had developed too far to turn back now. Thus, he swiftly locked in, taunting the devil for being huge as fuck. The devil replied that it wasn't huge, Dwayne was just tiny. But that aside, he hoped Dwayne would be big enough to increase the size of his flesh sack. Dwayne growled in response. If the devil wanted his skin, then he had to come and get it. He immediately shot forward, landing a nasty punch on his gut. The blow sent the fiend reeling, but it quickly tanked that shit. It then looked at Dwayne mockingly, asking if that's all he had. If so, then he was truly disappointing. Dwayne said bet and lunged forward. He came in with a heavy Superman punch, clocking the devil straight in the jaw. Pressing the attack, he launched another punch, swinging for the devil's flank. However, the latter counterattacked and swung back, chopping at Dwayne's skull. Dwayne noticed this and effortlessly parried, opening the devil for a brutal counterattack. He sprang in for a savage uppercut, yeeting the devil into the air. The force left it wheezing, causing it to cough up blood as it got tossed around like a rag doll. It crashed heavily into the ground, low-key looking like a satisfied maiden. Obviously, Dwayne exploited this chance and rashed in for the finisher. He flew in with a Superman punch, thrashing the devil soon after. Watching from the sideline, Kara couldn't help but get moist from the violence. She'd known Dwayne was strong, but holy fuck, she didn't know he could swing like that. Barring any surprises, the fight was over, and they didn't even have to lift a finger. Jeong, however, kept his cool, though he low-key felt like something was off. He didn't know why, but the fact that the devil never let go of his sack left him feeling some type of way. He called out to Kara, instructing the maiden to get ready. Kara was confused, but she promptly did as told. Jeong was Poppy after all, so she just had to follow his instructions. Back to Dwayne, he shouted incredulously, wondering what the hell was going on. Could it be that after talking so much shit, the devil would be clapped just like that? Nah, he doubted it. But the sight before him was more than clear. The devil was truly dead, and even its soul was out for the taking. Hold up, what the fuck was going on? This bizarre scene puzzled the trio, who could only watch on in tense silence. But as the seconds ticked by, they had no option but to accept things for what they were. The devil was truly, seemingly dead, and they'd apparently killed it. Dwayne took that chance to collect the soul, and what he received made him more puzzled. Sure, the devil was dead, and its soul was out. Although it was hard to believe, he could barely accept it based on their current situation. But what the hell was this? How was it possible that he'd received just 3 souls for his troubles? If they wanted to sell this bogus story, shouldn't they have placed more effort into it? How were they to believe things were truly over if they gave such trash rewards? Jeong chimed in at that moment, instructing Dwayne to focus. He didn't know what was going on, but his gut told him they should do just that. Dwayne returned a confused glance. He wanted him to focus, but how was he supposed to do that? The boss was already dead, so what was he to focus on? Jeong replied that he didn't know, but if he were to guess, they should probably start with the suspicious sack. He didn't know why, but his danger sense always flared every time he looked at it. Besides, things were beyond bizarre, so would it really be a bad thing to focus a little harder? As they were talking, the sack suddenly shook before exploding with a resounding bang. The unexpected change left the trio reeling, and they could only frantically flee to save their lives. After distancing themselves from the explosion, both Kara and Jeong turned to Dwayne, who'd been closer to the impact. They asked if he was okay, to which Dwayne replied that he was. He'd been lucky this time, and had kept his guard up the entire time. Maybe it was because of Jeong's warning, but his focus never left the sack, luckily so, or else he truly would have died. Zeroing in on the sack, the trio watched it shake before a hand shot from within. This greatly surprised them, but it was nothing compared to what came next. An overwhelming aura suddenly pressed down on them, accompanied by an intense feeling of danger. This feeling originated from the sack, which shook violently as a silhouette crawled out of it. After making its way out, the entity didn't hesitate to lock onto the trio. It smiled maliciously at them, asking if they'd missed it. But that aside, wasn't it his turn now? They did have the last attack, so it was only fair that it attacked first this time. Hearing the words, Jeong felt an indescribable feeling of dread. He couldn't rationalize it, but his instincts were screaming this wasn't a fight he could win. For the first time, he truly felt helpless, and he had no idea what he should do about it. The devil ignored the panicked look in his eyes and calmly pointed at him. Its voice came out husky as it declared Jeong's fate. He would be first. This declaration spooked Jeong, and his body trembled uncontrollably. He shouted at the duo to distance themselves, hoping it would save them from the onslaught. However, he'd severely underestimated the enemy. It moved with such ridiculous speed that it practically teleported before him. The duo didn't even get a chance to withdraw before it launched its first attack. Luckily, it was aimed at Jeong, so his goal was achieved somehow. Regrettably, even that single attack was beyond absurd. It easily shredded Jeong's defenses, chopping off his arm. He cried out in pain, but the devil just looked at him passively. There were no emotions in its eyes, almost as if what it did was insignificant. Cracking its neck, it delivered the next bombshell to Jeong. It would kill all of them, but special attention would be placed on him. This revelation made Jeong tremble, but he couldn't mull over it as Dwayne came in with a killer punch. He tried to stop him, but it was too late. The devil easily caught it and snapped his hand immediately after. It then counterattacked with a nasty punch, sending him flying like a rag doll. Realizing the severity of the situation, Kara joined in with a fireball. She made it as deadly as she could, but even that was easily parried by the devil. This left Kara spooked, and all color drained from her face. For the first time in a while, she truly felt it. The stench of death. The devil, however, stared at her calmly and threatened in its husky voice. It warned Kara not to interfere, or else it would abandon Jeong and flay her skin first. If they knew what was good for them, then they'd wait patiently for their turn. If not, then it didn't mind showing them a different way to hell. It then walked towards Jeong, who was busy tending to his wounds. The respite hadn't been long, but it was enough for basic first aid. With that done, Jeong decided to go all in. He knew it was do or die, so he didn't hold back in the slightest. He burnt through his souls, leveling up all the skills in his repertoire. He even leveled them up 10 times, showing just how serious he was. Without hesitation, he let chaos reign, calling upon the 8th door from the get-go. He also activated Blast, making this the strongest he'd ever been. However, the power didn't blind him to the severe pressure his body was under. It felt like a truck had run him over, and the sensation was getting worse by the second. Ignoring the sensation, he walked up to the devil. Technically, it had teleported before him, but that didn't stop him from handling business. It swung at him, but this time Jeong was prepared. He nimbly dodged to the side, counterattacking with a punch to the gut. The blow left the devil dazed, but only for a moment. It quickly recovered, grabbing onto Jeong's hand. Satisfied that its prey couldn't escape, the devil flicked its crimson gaze at him. It let out a dry chuckle, genuinely amused by Jeong's power-up. Had he used up all his souls? Probably bled dry his potential just to survive longer? Well, it was such a shame, as even that much wouldn't be enough. Not to mention the power was only temporary, for even a fool could tell his body couldn't handle it. It sure was a shame, but at least he could entertain it for a little bit longer. Jeong didn't argue and directly lunged in. Why would he speak when his hands could do the talking? He clashed head-on with the devil, kicking up a windstorm from the impact. After the first clash came the second, and soon the fight turned into a brutal melee, with both parties trading blows. The clash got so bloody that Dwayne and Kara couldn't help but wince by the sidelines. They knew they had to help, but they had no idea how to even begin. Realizing this, Kara shot Dwayne a resolved glance. She didn't have to say anything. Her gaze alone told him she was ready for death. She would intervene to help Jeong, and she would do it even if it cost her her life. Dwayne nodded in reply, hinting that he was ready for the same. He would give it his all, even if they ended up dying together. Kara said bet and sprang to action. She condensed her fireball, hoping to create an opportunity with some chaos. Jeong, however, continued his tango. But it was obvious things were going downhill fast. He'd already lost an eye, and his body was full of openings that the devil viciously exploited. It unleashed a 3-hit combo, causing him to cough up a mouthful of blood. Dreading his demise, Jeong said "fuck that" and sank into the shadows. He narrowly escaped a fatal claw, spawning behind the devil soon after. Without hesitation, he slashed at it, hoping to shed some crimson blood. Regrettably, this was L.A.G, and things wouldn't end so swiftly. Damn. Although he successfully landed the slash, the devil completely ignored it and clawed in retaliation. It unleashed a wide crescent claw, which Jeong barely managed to escape from. Leveraging the devil's distraction, he spawned behind it again, going for yet another sneak attack. However, this time the devil was ready. It quickly turned around, forcing Jeong back into the shadows. Ignoring the momentary loss, Jeong didn't give up and came in with yet another attack. He was hoping the third time would be the charm, but again, this was L.A.G, and such foolishness couldn't be tolerated. The devil trapped him, grabbing him firmly by the arm. This made it impossible to escape into the shadows, meaning Jeong was in big trouble. Seemingly relishing the horror on Jeong's face, the devil smirked at him before swinging for the kill. It went for a fatal claw attack, hell-bent on tearing his neck off. Jeong, however, realized the doomed situation and responded in kind. He decisively sacrificed his leg, using it to block the incoming attack. To this, the devil looked at him and chuckled even louder. He'd already lost his left eye, left hand, and now his right leg was damaged. How many body parts was he planning to sacrifice in order to save his pitiful life? Well, it was pointless to ask. It just had to torture him slowly to find out. It thus swung at him, this time aiming for Jeong's heart. Just as Jeong was despairing, lamenting his inability to block this strike, a flaming blade cut between them, severing both the devil's arms. This timely intervention saved Jeong, who had honestly been doomed to die. Of course, the devil didn't take this kindly and counterattacked with fury. It Leonidas the shit out of Jeong, yelling, "This is Sparta." Confused by Not's 300 reference, Jeong glided through the air, crashing pathetically into the wall. He wanted to sneak a peek at the famous and delicious abs, but the fight was too intense to shout pause right now. Thus, he could only pass out quietly as the devil shifted its focus to Kara. It quickly teleported to her, catching the baddie off guard. Worst part? Its arms had also regenerated, making all the maiden's efforts pointless. Kara noticed this, and her face changed drastically. She wanted to retaliate, but the homie Dwayne beat her to it. He came in with a brutal punch, yeeting the devil in the face. However, this motherfucker was more goated than the squad imagined. Without any techniques or flashy moves, it directly tanked the attack using nothing but its neck muscles to stop the punch. This was indeed monstrous, especially if you considered Dwayne's superhuman strength. Regrettably, it was too late now, and Dwayne couldn't escape even if he wanted to. The attack brought him close enough to the devil that he could smell its breath, which also meant he was perfectly within its attack radius. Obviously, it didn't hesitate to counterattack, blessing Dwayne with a mean gut punch. The punch was so powerful that it tore into his stomach, making a complete mess of his innards. This caused Dwayne immense pain, but he soldiered through it and grabbed the devil's horn. Using it as an anchor, he pulled himself towards the fiend, all while preparing a devastating attack. He punched the absolute, honest-to-God living shit out of the devil, burying its head into the ground. However, this glorious feat didn't come without consequences. The devil sneakily counterattacked, digging its claws deeper into Dwayne's stomach. It also shredded them a little bit, causing Dwayne to topple over and pass out. With one enemy down, the devil slowly recovered and loomed over the unconscious Dwayne. It planned to finish him off completely, but that was quickly stopped by a sneak attack from Kara. The baddie hurled a fireball at it, clocking it straight in the face. She then used the explosion as a smokescreen, lunging in for a decisive melee. Due to her blazing swords, she easily cut into its flesh, slashing off a chunk of the devil's waist. However, the fiend was truly monstrous, so it just flexed its waist to full recovery. It didn't even leave behind a scar, showing just how ludicrous its regeneration was. As for Kara, she was too stunned to deal with the devil's counterattack. She quickly got captured, tightly ensnared by the devil's tail. Once again, she was in mortal danger, and her fate, just like the squad's, was proving more and more hopeless. Just as the devil was giving her the Wayne Brady treatment, choke a bitch, a bloody knight in shining armor rashed in, slashing off its tail. The knight was obviously Jeong, who'd apparently regained consciousness after his previous pitiful defeat. However, things were looking grim, evidenced by the fact that Jeong was forced to use his own mutilated hand to attack. Not only that, he was the last one standing, as both Dwayne and Kara were effectively out of the fight. Jeong realized this and wisely locked in. He decisively threw himself at the devil, betting all his chips on the final gamble. If he couldn't bring it down, then they were all dead, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Damn. Why did everything have to be so fucked? We take a brief break from the fight and jump back in time. Back when the squad was still in the gloomy hallway, Kara revealed to the boys what her eye could do. It was apparently called the Eye of Ifrit, and according to her knowledge, it was by far the strongest skill in all of their arsenal. However, with the power came a great drawback. She couldn't move her body while using that power. That's why it was saved as a last resort, and could only be used in the company of people she absolutely trusted. Dwayne picked up on her words and told her not to worry. If she ever needed to use the eye, she should do so comfortably because they would protect her. Kara thanked him, but Loki hoped she wouldn't have to. That was because if she was truly forced to use the eye, then it meant the group was facing a hopeless and desperate situation. No matter how broken the ability was, She truly hoped they would never get to that point. Fast forward to the present, and Kara's worst nightmare is slowly manifesting. Not only is the squad in dire straits, all hope seems lost as Jeong, the last force, is also at his wit's end. He ruthlessly stabbed the devil, but like all the times before, it easily tanked it, not budging an inch. To this, Jeong stabbed deeper, finally eliciting a reaction from the fiend. However, it wasn't the reaction Jeong expected. Instead of protecting its slowly decapitating head, the devil squatted down before rocketing into the air. It crashed heavily into the ceiling, using Jeong as a bona fide meat cushion. Of course, the damage was brutal, forcing Jeong to cough up blood. However, that was the least of his problems since the devil had more torture in store for him. As the devil straight up violated Jeong, Kara finally stirred from her slumber, regaining her consciousness. She immediately shot up, confused by what she was seeing before her. Jeong was in horrible shape, and it wasn't an exaggeration to say he was hanging on by a thread. His body was completely bloody, proving just how torturous his experience had been. However, despite the pain, he still held on, refusing to let go of the devil. He even occasionally counterattacked, a scene that greatly surprised Kara. Just as she was contemplating her intervention, the devil suddenly moved, crashing Jeong into the right wall. It then repeated the same thing on the left wall, going back and forth between the two. This relentless barrage left Jeong in dire straits, but he did his best to soldier on. He knew he couldn't let go. Otherwise, the tiny embers of hope would truly extinguish. With that drive, he channeled all his madness and endured the barrage. He even tanked it when the devil full-on unleashed an onslaught of punches on him. Gritting his teeth, Jeong summoned all his power and tore off the devil's head. He then collapsed to the floor, panting, too exhausted to lift a finger. Not only that, the backlash from using the 8th door soon arrived, making his already horrible situation worse. Without a doubt, he was at his weakest, and even a careless breath could end his life. Realizing his desperate situation, Kara ran to him, but Jeong had more important things to worry about. Turns out the devil was still alive, and was slowly making its way to him. Matter of fact, losing its head wasn't a fatal blow. Rather, a slight inconvenience to it. This revelation horrified Jeong, who couldn't even lift a finger to defend himself. His horror drastically increased when he realized the devil could regenerate its head. Truly, things were hopeless, and this wasn't a fight they were meant to win in the first place. Just as Jeong was despairing, Kara walked forward, finally taking off her eye patch. Her aura suddenly shifted, making an overwhelming pressure press down on the room. This surprised Jeong, but it was nothing compared to what came next. When Kara unleashed her trump card, the air suddenly shook, rapidly heating up like a miniature inferno. It was then drawn to her palm, quickly coalescing into an orb of doom. The pressure became unbearable, and even the headless devil sensed its peril. It immediately shot forward, hoping to stop Kara before she unleashed her attack. However, this reaction was within Kara's expectation. In fact, it was more accurate to say she hoped for it. If the devil had truly run away, Kara would have been helpless, as she couldn't move while activating the skill. But since the devil willingly sought its death, who was she to deny its wish? She calmly looked on as it charged at her. Even when it stabbed her chest and Jeong's panicked shout echoed through the room, she maintained her smile, not letting it fade in the slightest. After regaining her mobility, the first thing Kara did was grab onto the devil's arm. She did so to bind it, preventing any escape from her ensuing attack. With that done, she let it fly, blitzing the absolute shit out of the devil. The strike basically annihilated its upper body, showing just how goated it was. Damn. Staring at the slightly swaying devil, the duo watched its movements with bated breaths. Would it finally go down? Or would L.A.G do the L.A.G thing and fuck them over again? Luckily, the worst didn't happen, and the boss dropped to the floor dead. It also spat out a soul, meaning the damn thing was truly dead. But even still, the duo didn't lower their guards until the door appeared. It was only after they were allowed to leave that they fully relaxed. One can never be too careful in L.A.G, especially in an almost impossible room like the present one. With that done, the duo could finally take a beat to assess their current conditions, and it wasn't great. Kara, in particular, suffered a gruesome injury that made her collapse immediately. Jeong wanted to tend to her, but his own wounds were serious as well. Not to mention there was still the homie Dwayne, who was sprawled out on the floor like a dead dog. Without a doubt, the trial had been grueling, and the squad barely managed to survive it. In fact, this was the closest they'd ever come to death since entering this hellish game. And rightfully so, because the boss was an absolute monster. Realizing he couldn't afford to be negligent, Jeong forced his body to move as he tended to the passed-out duo. He quickly handled their wounds before succumbing to unconsciousness as well. After hours of unnerving silence, Kara finally stirred before regaining consciousness. She cast her gaze to the side, and what she saw terrified her. Jeong was out cold, and his body was in an even worse state. It wouldn't be a surprise if he straight up died there. Kara realized this and sprang to her feet. She ruthlessly ignored her own wounds and rushed to the ladder. Fighting back her anxiety, she shook Jeong hard, yelling for him not to leave her. He couldn't die, not until they left that cursed place. Jeong felt her heart and gradually woke up. He told her he wouldn't die. So would she stop yelling already? That aside, how were she and Dwayne feeling? Had the potions he dumped on them been effective? Kara replied that they were, but one of them came with serious problems. It essentially disappeared her ass, bringing her back to the cheekless days. Jeong told her not to kid herself. Her cheeks had always been inconsistent. In fact, if it wasn't for the intensity of the fight, Not would have flamed her already. Anyway, there was something she had to know, and it was better if she did so sooner rather than later. The Eye of Ifrit wasn't as straightforward as she'd believed. It would continuously use her power regardless of her physical condition. If she found herself in horrible shape and didn't seal it with the eye patch in time, then the eye would continue to draw from her power until it killed her completely. This was something she had to pay attention to, lest she killed herself by accident. Kara nodded in understanding before shrugging the matter off. They were in L.A.G, so would one additional thing trying to kill her really make a difference? They were already fighting for their lives, so this shouldn't be a problem. Zeroing in on Jeong's stump, Kara asked if he was okay. Jeong replied that he was, so Kara shouldn't worry. All he needed was a little rest and his passive skill, and he'd be as good as new. As they talked, Dwayne finally regained consciousness as well. He looked around dazedly before shuddering in fear. Where was it? Where was the devil that had been smoking their asses? Jeong replied that they'd killed it, although barely. They managed to stay alive, but that was mostly due to Kara and her overpowered ability. Dwayne sighed in relief before relaxing his tense muscles. He didn't say it out loud, but he genuinely believed they'd die this time. The battle was basically hopeless, and it was a miracle they'd even survived. Luckily, things had worked out, and that's all that mattered. Ignoring their near-death experience, the trio collectively decided to rest a bit before moving forward. They were all in horrible shape, so moving around recklessly would only get them killed. They thus rested for a while before gathering by the exit. With Jeong leading the way, they finally left the room and arrived at their next destination. Room B716. This room was similar to the last in that you had to walk a great distance before arriving at the true destination. The squad did just that as they reflected on their current situation. They were all heavily injured, and even the little rest didn't do much to change that. If they couldn't find a vendor or a healing pod to stock up and heal, then things would get real dicey real soon. Regrettably, this was L.A.G, so of course things wouldn't be so smooth. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the squad finally reached the next room, a pitch-black void lit only by the glowing runes etched into the walls. This greatly surprised the trio, especially since the boss was nowhere in sight. Not to mention the exit door was clearly visible, almost as if they could leave at will. Just what the hell was going on? Instead of feeling relieved, the squad tensed up even more, knowing for a fact things couldn't be that easy. There are never free lunches in the world, and that is especially true for a hell like L.A.G. They cautiously looked around until Kara noticed something peculiar. The wall, or rather the runes etched on it, were moving. They slid down the walls, converging at the center. It might have been beautiful, if not for the suffocating pressure that accompanied it. Soon, under the squad's tense gazes, the runes converged, taking on a serpentine form. It became truly humongous, almost filling up the massive room. The trio stared at it and couldn't suppress the chill in their hearts. They wondered how they were meant to beat that thing, especially in their pathetic condition. Not to mention, what was up with that character profile? Wasn't L.A.G asking for a little too much this time? Ignoring their dazed expressions, the snake charged up a massive fireball, preparing to fire it at them. This finally broke the trio's trance, and they frantically scrambled to evade. However, the strike was insanely fast, so it caught up to them in an instant. It quickly blasted them away, turning the entire room into a miniature inferno. After the flames died down, the snake watched in anticipation, expecting to find a heap of bones. Unexpectedly, the trio were completely unharmed, having survived thanks to the Mommy Kara. The baddie was truly the mother of flames, as she easily tanked that. She even had enough in the tank and quickly launched a counterattack. A massive pillar of flames sprayed toward the snake, blasting its head back. It hissed in pain for a while, but quickly ignored it. This surprised the duo, who could only look at it incredulously. What level of monstrosity was this snake at to so easily tank that shit? And what level of absurdity was this room at to expect them to beat such a thing? It was truly crazy. Looking back, Kara told the Chads she'd be counting on them this time. Since the snake had an obvious resistance to fire, her attacks would probably be ass in this fight. She'd be depending on the duo to kill it and get them out of there alive. Jeong said bet before giving his instructions. He told Dwayne to split up and try his best to draw the snake's attention. As for himself, he'd do what he did best and clap some cheeks. Who knows? Maybe this inferno servant would be the best catalyst to balloon up Kara's flattened cheeks. Fingers crossed.